The story of John Marston does not begin on a government train or on a quiet ranch under a dying sun. It begins with a scar, a jagged mark across a boy's face, long before it became the iconic emblem of a broken gunslinger staring down the end of the West. Before the missions, before the bounties, there was a half-starved child in a world that did not want him. That scar is more than an injury. It is the living embodiment of the life that shaped him. Shot in the face during a robbery at around 10 years old, John Marston should have died nameless in some forgotten alley. Instead, he survived, carrying on his skin the proof that violence and abandonment claimed him long before any government ever did. In the truest sense, this is a story of a boy carved into an outlaw, of freedom promised and then weaponized. From its humble beginnings in the early 1870s, John's life runs alongside the last decades of the American frontier. His mother dies when he is young. His father, a drunk of Scottish and Irish blood, loses the use of his legs in a wagon accident, then dies in a bar, fight over a prostitute. No noble lineage, no heroic origin, just a lost soul drifting through orphanages he keeps running away from, chased by hunger, by cruelty, by the slow realization that the world was changing and had no place for a boy with nothing. Into this emptiness ride Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews. Two conmen, two dreamers, two men ready to rob the world and then explain why it deserved it. They find John as a scrawny 12 or 13-year-old thief trying to steal from the wrong marks. A child attempting to rob two professional robbers, the kind of situational irony the frontier excelled at. Instead of killing him, they recruit him. In that moment, the van der Linde gang's legend gains its first true heir. From that point through the 1880s and 1890s, the gang becomes John's entire universe. A family of outlaws, a philosophy of freedom. Dutch preaches loyalty and rebellion, Hosea tempers idealistic dreams with hard-earned caution, and John grows from reckless golden boy to trusted enforcer. Around them, the old ways were dying as railroads, telegraphs, and Pinkertons spread across the land. The gang imagines itself standing against civilization, yet money, power, and progress begin to twist their code from the inside. Across these years, from the very beginning of John's birth in the 1870s to the eve of Red Dead Redemption in the early 1900s, his life and the gang's rise and fall mirror the changing nation. Fathers and sons, loyalty and betrayal, freedom and control, the van der Linde gang becomes a microcosm of America's myth and its hypocrisy. What happens when a found family built on outlaw ideals collides with a world determined to erase them? How does a scarred boy become the reluctant gun the government points back at his own past? This video reconstructs that entire hidden saga. Drawing from in-game dialogue, side missions, and stray lore, it will stitch together John Marston's untold years into one continuous story. From half-orphaned child to the man stepping off that train, carrying every wound the audience never saw. To tell that hidden saga, the story cannot rely on a single neat flashback or a convenient exposition dump. Rockstar never hands over John Marston's youth as one clean, linear account. It is scattered in the margins, buried in passing campfire conversations, tossed out as half-jokes during missions, and hinted at through the way other characters flinch when his past comes up. His life before Red Dead Redemption is there, but it lives in fragments. This section will gather those fragments and lay them out in order, from the very beginning. From his half-Scottish, half-Irish parents and a childhood defined by a drunk father in a broken wagon, to the nameless gunman who shot a 10-year-old boy in the face and left that crooked scar, this will be a story of a child shaped by violence before he ever picked up a revolver. From its humble beginnings in an unnamed farm and a squalid orphanage, John's path will be traced step by step until it reaches the dust of New Austin. The promise is simple, even if the man is not. A chronological reconstruction will follow John through his first petty crimes, through the moment Dutch and Hosea catch him stealing at 12 or 13 and decide to turn a lost soul into a proc, through the early, half-mythic years when Dutch's gang still felt idealistic and small. It will chart how John becomes Dutch's golden boy, the trusted enforcer sent on dangerous jobs, the young outlaw who believes this ragged camp really is a family in the truest sense. To build that timeline, the method must be as disciplined as the man John tries to become. His own stories will be cross-referenced with Arthur's journal, Javier's memories, Abigail's weary remarks, and the cold precision of in-world dates and historical context. When John mentions an orphanage, when Abigail recalls him disappearing before Blackwater, when Dutch praises or condemns him, each line will be pinned to a moment in the wider world, a world where the old ways were dying and civilization pressed in on every frontier. The tone will match that world. Dramatic, reflective, and grounded, this reconstruction will cling to what the games actually show or strongly imply, clearly marked whenever the narrative steps from confirmed canon into reasonable inference. When the story leans on speculation, it will say so. When it rests on what is on screen, it will stand firm. The goal is not to invent a new John Marston, but to reveal the one already hiding in plain sight. From there, the path narrows. To understand John the outlaw, the reluctant gun the government turns on his own past, the story must begin earlier still. Before the scar, before the gun, before Dutch rides in and offers a philosophy of freedom and family, there is only a frightened boy watching his father die in a bar fight and an orphan running from every home given to him. That is where the next part begins, with John Marston as a child, long before anyone called him a hero or a traitor. The story of John Marston does not begin with Dutch's speeches or government blackmail. It begins with a broken family that was barely a family at all, a line already splintered before John ever touched a gun. From its humble beginnings in the mud of the frontier, the Marston name is less a legacy and more a warning. John's father is the clearest figure, and yet he is a blur. A Scottish immigrant drifting through an American world he never truly understands. He chases work, whiskey, and whoever will share his bed for a night. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of the old ways we're dying, a man raised on promises of freedom and land, spat out by a civilization that has no patience for his weakness. Instead of raising his son, he raises a bottle. Instead of offering guidance, he offers slurred stories of a country that never really wanted him. John's mother is even less. Not a character, but an absence. She dies when John is very young, of causes he never clearly names, and that silence matters. In a world full of tall tales and barroom boasts, the one story John cannot tell is the story of his own mother. That empty space becomes a wound he spends his life trying to close, reaching for substitute families, for gangs and ranches and camps that might finally feel permanent. How can a boy understand family when his first one vanishes almost without a trace? The frontier finishes what misfortune begins. One day, John's father is riding in a wagon, drunk, careless, trusting the trail more than his own hands. The horses spook, the wagon tips, and the weight of wood and iron comes crashing down. The land that promised opportunity literally crushes him, shattering his legs and what little pride he has left. From then on, he is a crippled man dragged through saloons and back alleys, bitter at a world that took his stride and left him nothing but pain. He dies as he lives, in a bar, drunk, arguing over a prostitute he cannot afford and does not respect. A fight breaks out, bottles shatter, fists fly, and somewhere in the chaos a knife or a bullet finds him. On the floor, bleeding into sawdust and spilled liquor, lies the future John refuses to inherit. Is this what manhood means to a Marston, pathetic, angry, forgotten? John watches, a boy in the doorway, seeing his father's blood mixed with cheap whiskey, learning that the world does not save men like this. The old ways were dying, but nothing better is rushing in to replace them. No sheriff steps in. No preacher offers comfort. No distant relative appears to claim the child. In that moment, the lesson is simple and cruel. Nobody is coming to rescue a Marston. But if no one comes to save him, who will he become when someone finally comes to claim him? The answer comes, in the end, from a gun. John is around 10 when the world makes its first real decision about him, not through a judge's sentence or a preacher's sermon, but through the blind chaos of a robbery gone wrong. A store, a street, some nameless men with guns and hunger in their eyes. The exact details blur in his memory, because what matters is the flash, the sound, and the way the world simply disappears when the bullet hits his face. He is not an outlaw yet. He is a child standing in the wrong place when civilization bares its teeth. The shot tears into his cheek and jaw, drops him to the floor, and leaves him bleeding among strangers who have no reason to stay. The robbers flee. The customers scatter. For a moment, John Marston is just another small body on a dirty plank floor. One more reminder that the world was changing, and that the old ways were dying without becoming any kinder. From its humble beginnings, this is a story of violence choosing John before he ever chooses it. That wound, hastily tended by whoever bothers to drag him to help, does not kill him. It carves him. It becomes the signature scar that will define his face decades later, the living embodiment of a single childhood instant when fate pulled the trigger and missed by an inch. In the truest sense, it is a twisted rite of passage. Other boys earn their place through chores, through school, through the slow rituals of family. John's initiation comes through muzzle flash. Before he ever hears Dutch's speeches about freedom and philosophy, the world brands him as both victim and survivor of crime. He learns that men will kill for a handful of dollars, that a child's life weighs almost nothing on the scales of greed. What does that do to a 10-year-old mind? A near-death moment like that teaches 3 lessons. Death arrives without warning, mercy is optional, and survival is an accident that demands repayment. If his life is cheap to others, then perhaps it must become expensive to him, guarded behind hardness, behind a gun, behind the same cold resolve he saw in the men who left him there. The scar ensures no one ever fully forgets that day, least of all John. Adults see it and make their own judgments. Some underestimate him, assuming the crooked smile and damaged flesh belong to a broken, harmless boy. Others flinch, reading danger where there is only a wounded child, reacting to the mark rather than the man. Either way, the scar speaks first. It tells a story before John can open his mouth. For him, it is a mirror and a prophecy. Every time he catches his reflection, he is reminded that he has already been chosen by violence once. Marked by fate, labeled by the world, pushed toward a life where guns answer questions that words never will. And beneath that mark lies a question that will haunt him into adulthood. When a boy is shot in the face and lives, is he meant for something, or is he cursed? Is survival a blessing, or the beginning of a debt he will spend the rest of his life trying and failing to pay? Survival left a scar on his face. The orphanage carved the rest of them on the inside. After his father died in a bar fight, and the world quietly closed its door on the Marston name, John was shipped off to an institution whose name he never bothers to share. That silence is telling. In a story of the American West that worships wide horizons, his next years unfold behind walls, stone, brick, and rules. From its humble beginnings as a charity for the unwanted, the place had become a warehouse for children no one claimed. The dormitories were overcrowded, rows of iron beds and thin mattresses, the air heavy with sweat, sickness, and whispered nightmares. Caretakers moved through that world with the bored rhythm of men and women doing a job, not answering a calling. They prayed before meals, beat knuckles with rulers, and preached about sin to boys who barely understood what they had lost, much less what they had done wrong. Food was served, chores were assigned, prayers were recited. But no one tucked John in, no one said his name with warmth. The institution fed and housed children. It did not love them. Discipline there came wrapped in religion and casual cruelty. A missed chore meant a slap. A fight meant a beating. A question about freedom meant a sermon about obedience and civilization. In the truest sense, it was a place designed to break wildness and replace it with fear. For a boy already marked by violence, already convinced that fate had singled him out, it confirmed a brutal lesson. The world was changing, and children without families were not being saved. They were being managed. So John ran. Of course he did. The first time, he slipped out through a coal chute, walking for miles until hunger bent his back and strangers' eyes turned sharp. Dragged back by a sheriff more amused than angry, he was whipped, lectured, and put to work. The second time, he stole bread and tried the railroad tracks, following the promise of elsewhere until cold nights and empty pockets drove him into the arms of another lawman. Each escape ended in pain, but each return hardened a belief that would define his philosophy: better danger on the road than safety in a cage. Those orphanage years planted a deep, stubborn distrust. Government officials, priests, matrons, all claimed to protect. All enforced rules that hurt. To John, institutions were not guardians. They were fences with sermons attached. Was it any surprise that later, when federal agents spoke of law and duty, he heard only chains? Eventually, one escape worked. No one came looking. A preteen now, John drifted between towns, sleeping in barns, under porches, in ditches. He stole to eat, lied to survive, and learned that a gun pointed at a traveler's purse could mean one more day alive, or one bullet in the dark. He was one bad decision away from vanishing into an unmarked grave. Then, on a dusty road, two outlaws watched a scrawny boy try to rob them and did not reach for their guns first. What did they see in that half-starved, scarred child, a nuisance, or the living embodiment of their own dreams and delusions about freedom and family? The story of Dutch and Hosea does not begin with John or Arthur or a campfire sermon about freedom. It begins on a lonely road with a stagecoach, two pistols, and one very unfortunate coincidence. Dutch van der Linde stepped out first, all swagger and theater, coat flaring, voice booming as he ordered the horses to halt. He was young, handsome, and already performing for an audience that did not exist, a self-taught philosopher playing the role of righteous outlaw. In his mind, this was not simple robbery. This was a small act of rebellion against a rotten civilization. Then Hosea Matthews stepped out from the other side. Older, quieter, eyes already measuring risk and reward, Hosea had picked the same coach, on the same day at the same bend in the road. Where Dutch moved in sweeping gestures and grand declarations, Hosea moved with careful economy. Every word chosen, every step calculated. Each man thought the other was part of the frightened cargo. For a long, suspended heartbeat, they both aimed at the same driver, then at each other, then back again. The passengers froze. The world was changing, but in that instant, time held its breath. Two outlaws, two plans, one mistake. It should have ended in blood. By all the rules of the dying frontier, by all the old ways of bandits and gunmen, one of them should have gone into the dust. Yet something in the absurdity of it all broke through first. Dutch smirked. Hosea snorted. The standoff cracked, not with a gunshot, but with a shared, incredulous laugh. That was the subversion at the very beginning of the van der Linde legend, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, that started not with a killing, but with recognition. Each man saw himself reflected in the other. Dutch saw a mind as sharp as his rhetoric. Hosea saw a charisma dangerous enough to change the world, or burn it down. Dutch was already preaching his philosophy to anyone who would listen, railing against railroads, banks, and government men in tailored suits. In the truest sense, he believed freedom meant living beyond their reach, robbing the rich and corrupt to prove that the game was rigged and that outlaws could write their own rules. Hosea, by contrast, understood limits. He knew when to walk away from a mark, when the odds were wrong, when a plan was just a pretty delusion. He was a conman who read people the way Dutch read books, and he could already see the cracks in Dutch's grand ideas, the places where ego might outrun reality. So they made a choice, not just to split the take, not just to work a few jobs together, but to build something larger than either could manage alone, a roaming family of misfits, held together by loyalty, sharpened by hardship, and guided, at least at first, by a shared code. From its humble beginnings on that road, the van der Linde gang was born not as a pack of killers, but as an argument made flesh. What happens when a dream of freedom becomes a way of life? The answer would arrive soon enough, in the form of a half-starved boy with a scarred face and nowhere else to go. That half-starved boy stepped into a world that promised him everything he had never been given: purpose, protection, and a name that meant something. Dutch's campfire sermons were the doorway. John Marston walked through without hesitation. From the very beginning, Dutch's creed sounded less like criminal justification and more like scripture. The world was changing, he said, but not for men like them. Railroads, banks, and government offices were just new faces on an old truth. The world was rigged for the rich and the powerful. The law was not justice, it was a weapon, polished and holstered for the benefit of civilization's owners. So Dutch offered an alternative. True freedom meant stepping outside those rules, refusing to kneel before judges, politicians, and businessmen who had never worked a day with their hands. An outlaw was not merely a thief. In Dutch's philosophy, an outlaw was the living embodiment of resistance. Rob a train, and it was not just a crime, it was a statement. Around this creed, he built more than a gang. He built a family in the truest sense, or at least that was the dream. Around the fire, there were no titles and no land deeds, only shared spoils and shared danger. Money went into a common box. Food was portioned so that children ate first, women were protected, and no one was left behind. For a boy who had bounced between an orphanage and the streets, who had watched institutions fail him at every turn, what could have sounded more holy than that? Dutch called camp a kind of utopia on the move, a traveling answer to a corrupt civilization. Yet even in those early years, the cracks were there. He loved speeches more than planning, loved the sound of his own rhetoric rolling over the hills more than the quiet work of figuring out how everyone would get out alive. A robbery gone bloody was necessary. A dead guard was the price of freedom. A burned ranch was a message. The human cost, to bystanders and to his own people, was something he preferred to edit out of the story. Hosea saw it. Where Dutch reached for poetry, Hosea reached for the map. He was the quiet counterweight, the man asking how many rifles the guards carried, how fast the posse could form, how far the gang could run before the snow closed in. When Dutch wanted grand gestures, Hosea argued for survival. When Dutch romanticized violence, Hosea counted bodies. Between them, a boy like John found his whole world. Dutch's grand words told him he was not a lost soul but a chosen one. Hosea's caution taught him how not to die for those words. How long could that balance last? The answer would define John's adolescence and the next bloody chapter of this story of freedom and betrayal. Before John ever rode into their lives with a scar on his face and a chip on his shoulder, the Vander Linde gang was still finding its shape. It was a story of scattered criminals orbiting two men with a plan, a drifting constellation of thieves, con artists, and drifters who kept coming back to the same fire. From its humble beginnings, this was less an organization and more a campfire covenant. Men who had run from chain gangs, women who had fled husbands, wanderers who had failed at honest work in a world that no longer wanted them, each arrived with their own petty crimes and private grief. They stayed because Dutch and Hosea offered something rare in that dying frontier: loyalty, protection, and the promise that no one would face the hangman alone. Camp life became the glue. At dusk, the smell of beans and coffee drew everyone toward the center, toward the pot that never quite emptied, and the stories that never quite ended. They ate from the same tin plates, passed the same bottles, and listened as Dutch turned simple meals into sermons about freedom and family. In theory, decisions were made together, with voices raised around the fire. In practice, most eyes drifted toward Dutch, then Hosea, waiting for the quiet nod that meant the matter was settled. Around those flames, Dutch built a world out of words. He read from tattered books, quoted philosophers half-remembered, and painted the gang as the living embodiment of resistance to a corrupt civilization. Railroads, banks, and government men became villains in his stories, faceless engines of progress grinding down the poor. The gang, in contrast, were outlaws in the truest sense, standing outside the law not for greed alone, but for some higher. If hazy principle, this was the moral positioning Dutch sold, and he sold it well. They robbed trains, not farmhouses, stagecoaches heavy with bonds, not wagons full of children. They hit corrupt officials, rich ranchers, and fat merchants when they could, telling themselves that each heist was a blow against a rigged system. The old ways were dying, Dutch insisted, and someone had to make the death of those ways hurt. Yet, the truth was more complicated. Even early on, when needless cruelty was frowned upon, guns still misfired into bystanders, guards still begged for their lives, and innocents still woke from nightmares of masked riders. Trauma followed their trail like smoke. Dutch's philosophy, his grand speeches about justice and progress, helped everyone look away from the faces behind the fear. Perhaps it even helped him forget them. So the campfire burned, illuminating both fellowship and denial. Around it, misfits became a family, at least for a while, and the gang's legend began to outgrow its crimes. But something was missing. For all Dutch's talk of legacy, he had yet to raise a child from the very beginning, to mold a boy into proof that his dreams were not delusions. This fragile world of stories and stolen freedom was waiting for its first true son, and John Marston was already stumbling toward that fire. And that is where Arthur Morgan steps in, turning Dutch's abstract dream into living proof. Before John Marston ever rides into camp, before the gang's legend hardens into myth, there is a teenager with nothing to lose and no one to answer to, stumbling toward the same fire Dutch has been tending since the very beginning. Arthur's childhood is a story of absence and anger. His mother dies when he is still young. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty criminal drifting through a world that has no patience for small-time outlaws as the world was changing and the old ways were dying. Lyle teaches his boy the wrong lessons: how to steal, how to run, how to shrug off consequence. Then he is arrested, locked away, and dies in prison, leaving Arthur alone, already halfway to the gallows and convinced that civilization has nothing to offer him but chains. By the time Dutch and Hosea cross his path, Arthur is a teenager living off theft and spite. They catch him in the act trying to rob them, two con men nearly being robbed by a boy too angry to be afraid. It should have ended with a beating or a rope. Instead, Dutch sees something else. He sees a lost soul, raw and unshaped, who might prove that his philosophy is more than pretty words. So rather than turn Arthur in, Dutch and Hosea take him under their wing, from its humble beginnings as a simple act of mercy into a lifelong bond. What follows is a dual apprenticeship that defines Arthur in the truest sense. Dutch feeds his mind, not his stomach. He teaches Arthur to read, to argue, to dress his crimes in the language of freedom and honor. The gang is not just a crew, Dutch insists. It is family, resistance, the living embodiment of an idealistic dream that refuses to bow to a rigged world. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, handles the rest. He shows Arthur how to shoot straight, how to pick the right pockets, how to run a con without getting killed in some back alley. Under their guidance, Arthur does not just survive. He becomes the emotional anchor of this fragile family. Around the campfire, he is the steady presence, the quiet enforcer of Dutch's rules. The man who believes, truly believes, that this outlaw campfire is kinder than the cold judgment of civilization. His loyalty is not blind, but it is deep, grounded in years of shared hunger, shared danger, shared dreams. For Dutch, Arthur is more than a proc. He is validation. If this angry boy can be turned into a loyal, principled outlaw, then Dutch can tell himself his philosophy works, that he is not a villain but a misunderstood father of a new kind of family. Yet, even as Arthur grows into Dutch's first true son, another child is already on the horizon, one who will test that philosophy in ways Arthur never could. Because what happens when Dutch tries to repeat the experiment? Dutch's experiment with Arthur proves something dangerous to him. It proves the method works. If a rough, angry boy can be reshaped into a loyal outlaw son, then why stop at one? Why not build an entire family, in the truest sense? Out of broken children and wandering adults who owe everything to Dutch van der Linde? From the very beginning, that urge is not just ideological, it is personal. Dutch hints at a childhood marked by absence and bitterness, a mother who died too young, a father he openly despises, a home that never felt like home. He speaks of his father as weak, beaten down by civilization, a man who surrendered to the world instead of fighting it. That hatred never really cools. It curdles into a philosophy. If his own parents failed him, then he will build a better version of parenthood out on the frontier, where the old ways were dying and new identities can be invented at gunpoint. Arthur becomes the first proof of concept. Loyal, capable, predictable, over the years he learns to anticipate Dutch's moods, to translate Dutch's speeches into action, to question just enough but never too much. That stability is comforting, but it is also a problem. For a man whose ego is tied to saving lost souls, what happens when the soul is already saved? When the boy has become a man who no longer needs rescuing? Dutch begins to crave something he will never admit, a new challenge, a fresh canvas, another child to mold who can reignite his sense of purpose and remind him that his dreams are not just dreams but destiny. Arthur is family now, almost a partner, and partners can disagree. Dutch does not simply want partners. He wants disciples, the living embodiment of his philosophy. People whose entire story begins and ends with him. That is the heart of his delusion. Dutch cannot simply ride with outlaws. He must be the father of outlaws, the prophet of freedom, the man who takes in the half-dead and gives them a name, a code, a cause. Their loyalty proves he is right. Their dependence proves he is necessary. Is it any wonder he keeps reaching for new strays, even when the camp is full? But there is danger in this pattern, a shadow under the rhetoric. When a man's sense of self depends on rescuing others, he does not just wait for broken people to appear. He seeks them out. He nurtures their wounds. He may even, without realizing it, make sure they never fully heal. Because a healed child might stand on his own 2 feet and walk away. Somewhere out in that changing world, a scarred, starving runaway is already stumbling from town to town, half orphaned, half feral, shot in the face, and left with a permanent reminder of how cruel civilization can be. Dutch and Hosea are about to cross paths with him, two aging con men in search of purpose, and one lost soul in search of a family. It will be a meeting that changes all three of their lives forever. The meeting happens in an instant, but its consequences echo for decades. In a muddy back alley behind a worn-down general store, a starving boy reaches for a pocket that does not belong to him, and stumbles straight into the story of the Vanderlinde gang. John Marston is 12, maybe 13. His mother is long dead, his drunk father died in a bar fight over a prostitute, and the orphanage that was supposed to save him has become another cage to run from. He is half feral, half frozen, and wholly desperate when he slips through the crowd and fingers the purse of a well-dressed stranger. The stranger is Dutch Vanderlinde, and Dutch is in the middle of robbing that town, that very street, that very man. For a moment, it is almost funny. Two thieves, one seasoned outlaw philosopher and one terrified child, both trying to steal the same wallet. Then the tension snaps. Dutch whirls, Hosea's hand goes to his gun, and the mark turns to shout before Hosea's quiet menace sends him scurrying. In a heartbeat, John finds himself staring down the barrels of two revolvers, his stolen coin purse spilling into the mud. He does not beg for his life. He spits blood, stammers that he has nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep, nowhere to eat. This is not bravado. It is exhaustion. Dutch studies him, seeing the torn boots, the sunken cheeks, the fresh scar carved across the boy's face from that Longago robbery gone wrong. More than that, he sees something in the eyes. Anger, yes. Hurt, yes. But also that raw, unshaped defiance that Dutch has spent years trying to turn into a philosophy. The old ways were dying, Dutch kept saying, and the world was changing into something colder, smaller, ruled by railroads and bankers. Here, in the mud, is the living embodiment of that claim, a child discarded by civilization, surviving on theft and stubbornness. Dutch lowers his gun first. Instead of punishment, he offers a hand. Instead of a beating, he offers bread, a blanket, a spot by the fire. He frames it as freedom in the truest sense, a chance to belong to a family that answers to no one. Hosea is slower to relent. He sees the risk in bringing a half-wild orphan into their circle, another mouth to feed, another potential traitor. Yet he also sees opportunity, a boy young enough to be taught, to be guided, maybe even steered away from the worst of the outlaw road. Trusting Dutch's instinct, and perhaps his own need to do one decent thing in a brutal world, Hosea nods and lets the guns fall. For John, this is the very beginning. An adult not only spares him, but claims him. From its humble beginnings in that alleyway, his loyalty is forged in hunger, gratitude, and misplaced faith. He steps toward Dutch, toward the campfire, toward the dreams and delusions that will define his life. He believes he has been rescued. The question is, rescued from what, and into what? Dutch does not just take the boy's hand. He turns the moment into a parable. For Arthur, years earlier, it had been almost the same scene. A teenager caught stealing, a gun half raised, and Dutch stepping in as judge, jury, and savior. Two different alleys, two different boys, one repeated script. In both cases, Dutch refuses to see a criminal. He insists on seeing a victim. Arthur is told he is not bad, only born into a bad world that never gave him a chance. John hears the same philosophy, almost word for word. The law is corrupt. Civilization is a lie. The real crime is letting good children be swallowed by institutions and gallows. It is a story of sin without sinners, of guilt displaced onto an abstract, uncaring world. To the camp, Dutch frames John's arrival as a triumph. Another child saved, another lost soul rescued from the orphanage, from the streets, from the faceless cruelty of wardens and sheriffs. Around the fire, he presents the boy as proof that their family is growing from its humble beginnings, that their robberies and raids are not mere outlaw greed, but a mission. Who else, he asks, would take in the broken and the unwanted in the truest sense? There is a pattern here, and Dutch leans into it. Arthur becomes the living embodiment of what his philosophy can create, a literate, thoughtful gun hand. John is cast as the sequel, the refinement. Two sons, both plucked from crime, both told they are not to blame. It sounds compassionate. It is also deeply convenient. For John, none of this nuance exists yet. He is a boy fresh from orphanages that treated him as a number and streets that treated him as prey. He has been shot in the face, abandoned, passed between adults who saw only trouble. Now there are warm meals, a bedroll by the fire, Hosea's dry jokes, and Dutch's voice rising over the crackle of wood. It hits him like a drug. Affection, purpose, belonging. How could he question the cost when he has never had anything to lose? Hosea's kindness is quiet, a hand on the shoulder while teaching him to skin a rabbit, a calm word when John's temper flares. Dutch's is theatrical, reading to him, explaining the world was changing, promising that the old ways were dying but their family would endure. Together they construct not just a camp, but a mythology in which John has a starring role. Dutch's favoritism shows early. He spends extra time correcting John's aim, praising his nerve, telling him he has a mind for leadership. Around others, he calls John a special one, a boy destined for greatness under proper guidance. Arthur had been the first son. John is the project, the experiment, the proof that Dutch can still shape the future. That elevation is a gift and a trap. By turning John into a symbol of his ideals, Dutch raises the stakes far beyond one boy's loyalty. Any future doubt from John will not just be disagreement. It will be betrayal on a mythic scale, a challenge to Dutch's entire story of who he is and what this family means. And Dutch is not a man who forgives challenges. The seeds are in the soil already, even if no one sees them yet. 2 sons, 1 pattern, and a philosophy that demands devotion. The question is not whether that pattern will break, but who will be blamed when it does. 2 sons, 1 pattern, and now 2 very different hearts beating inside it. From the very beginning of their shared story, Arthur and John are not just brothers in arms. They are opposing answers to the same question Dutch keeps asking the world. What does freedom truly cost? Arthur is the first answer. By the time John arrives, Arthur has already been shaped into the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. He is more reserved, more introspective, a boy who learned to read sermons about civilization and manifest destiny from Dutch's stolen books, and then rode out to rob the men who wrote them. For Arthur, Dutch's speeches are not just words. They are the thing that makes sense of all the blood. In a world where the old ways were dying and every town brings another gallows, Dutch's rhetoric gives Arthur a reason to keep pulling the trigger. John is the second answer, and he crashes into that fragile order like a thrown bottle. Hot-headed, sarcastic, forever reaching for the next fight or the next chance to prove himself, young John does not bow his head at Dutch's campfire stories. He listens, he smirks, he tests. Having already been shot in the face as a child and left to survive on his own, he trusts bullets and quick hands far more than elegant speeches about ideals. If Arthur asks what Dutch believes, John wants to know whether those beliefs still stand when the shooting starts. That difference turns admiration into friction almost immediately. Arthur, the established son, has spent years earning Dutch's rare praise, only to watch this half-grown stray suddenly become the new project. Dutch boasts about John's potential. Hosea laughs at his reckless charm, and Arthur feels something he does not want to name, threatened. To him, John looks less like a brother and more like a challenge. A reminder that in this family, loyalty is rewarded, but it is never guaranteed. John feels the edge of it too. He sees Arthur's seniority, the quiet nods Dutch gives him before every big decision, and he tastes teacher's pet in every order Arthur passes down. When Arthur corrects him, John hears condescension. When Arthur defends Dutch's philosophy, John hears a man trying to convince himself. 2 outlaws, riding the same trail, imagining very different destinations. Their arguments begin small. Arthur urges patience, John pushes for risk. Arthur quotes Dutch's talk of a better world. John demands to see it, here and now, in the money on the table and the bodies in the dust. Is this freedom or just a prettier prison? Is this family or only another gang with nicer words? In the truest sense, this is more than a sibling rivalry. It is a story of belief and doubt, of dreams and delusions wrestling inside one collapsing camp. One son wants to keep the faith, the other insists on proof. One day, that difference will decide who stays loyal, who walks away, and who dies trying to hold the philosophy together as it burns. John's doubts begin as whispers, not arguments. Before he can question Dutch's philosophy, he has to learn what it means to live it with a gun in his hand. From its humble beginnings, John's place in the gang is almost domestic. A 12-year-old runaway with a half-healed scar on his face is not handed a revolver and pointed at a bank. Dutch and Hosea put him to work where the risk is low, and the lessons are constant, tending horses in the cold dawn, rubbing them down after long rides, learning which saddle belongs to which outlaw. He runs messages between camps, carries notes to contacts in nearby towns, slips into stables to borrow a mule or a crate of supplies. Small theft, quiet errands, endless chores. It is the very beginning of his education. Dutch calls it responsibility. Hosea calls it earning trust. For a boy who has known only abandonment and institutions, being trusted with a horse or a sealed letter feels like being handed gold. Each successful errand is praised around the fire. Each small crime is wrapped in speeches about freedom and civilization, about taking back what the world stole from the poor. A story of loyalty and survival is being written into John long before bullets enter the page. But a gang built on robbery cannot keep its golden boy in the stables forever. At some point in the late 1880s, the work changes. The job is simple on paper, a small-town general store, or a lonely stagecoach rolling through Scrubland. The kind of target Dutch insists is insured and faceless. John's role is backup, stand in the doorway, hold the gun, look mean. His hands shake when he lifts the revolver. The metal feels too heavy, too permanent. The scar on his cheek burns with an old memory of being shot and left in the dirt. A clerk stares back at him, more confused than defiant, realizing that the boy in front of him is as scared as he is. For a strange second, it is almost situational irony. Two people equally terrified, one pretending to be the outlaw, the other pretending not to beg. Then Dutch's voice cuts through the moment, calm and absolute. No one has to die. No one gets hurt if they listen. John repeats the words, barely more than a whisper, but the barrel stays level. The money changes hands. The coach stops. The store empties its till. The world was changing for John Marston, and it changes in that instant. Afterward, Dutch claps him on the shoulder and calls him son. Hosea gives a quieter nod, but there is pride in it. Fear turns to adrenaline. Adrenaline hardens into pride. Violence, framed as protection of the family, becomes not just acceptable, but almost noble in the truest sense. How else can a lost soul prove he belongs? These unseen adolescent jobs accumulate. Storefronts, coaches, ranches on the edge of nowhere. Each one sands down the tremor in John's hand, sharpens his aim, teaches him how to move, when to speak, when to pull the trigger. By the time civilization knows his name in Red Dead Redemption, the seasoned gunman is already the living embodiment of a decade of such nights. Yet with every good job, son, another invisible chain wraps around him. Praise becomes a collar. Gratitude becomes debt. How does a man ever walk away from the one person who taught him not only how to survive, but how to kill? The answer to that question will not arrive gently, and it will not arrive without blood. John's answer, at least for a time, is to lean into the collar. If praise is a chain, then he decides to wear it proudly. Dutch sees that eagerness, that hunger to be worthy, and does what charismatic leaders in every collapsing world tend to do. He turns it into a role. John becomes the face. On bank jobs, it is the young man with the crooked smile who steps through the doors first, hat tipped, voice smooth, promising no one has to die if they just do as they are told. In cons across the heartlands, John plays the polite ranch hand or the nervous clerk, drawing eyes and sympathy while Hosea works the mark, and Dutch watches from the shadows. It is a story of performance and manipulation, of a boy who once begged for scraps now talking to bankers as if he belongs in their marble halls. Dutch encourages it at every turn. He calls John smart in front of Bill, brave in front of Javier, special in front of Arthur. Around the campfire, he recounts John's daring escapes, his quick thinking, his loyalty under fire, polishing every memory until it gleams. From its humble beginnings as a few kind words to a half-starved teenager, the praise grows into prophecy. John is not just useful, he is the one who will carry the philosophy forward when the old man finally lays down his guns. For Arthur, the effect is complicated. He remembers the very beginning, when he was the favored son, when Dutch corrected his grammar and quoted books at him as if education alone could keep the noose away. Now Arthur watches Dutch rest a hand on John's shoulder, hears the same speeches with slightly different words, and feels both pride and a dull ache. Pride, because John is family in the truest sense. Ach, because the living embodiment of Dutch's dreams is no longer the boy Dutch found in a ditch, but the boy Dutch dragged from an orphanage. Others handle it less gracefully. Bill notices that John's mistakes are forgiven with a laugh, while his own bring a tongue lashing. Javier watches Dutch defend John's temper, John's disappearances, John's doubts, and quietly files it away. Around the fire, when Dutch is absent, there are jokes about the golden boy, about how the world was changing, but Dutch still needs a favorite to feel young. John hears those jokes. He pretends not to. By then, the role has seeped into his bones. He believes he is different, that Dutch pulled him from the jaws of a brutal civilization and gave him not only freedom, but purpose. To question the gang would be to question his own identity. To leave would be a betrayal deeper than abandoning blood. And yet, the higher Dutch lifts him, the more precarious the pedestal becomes. What happens when the golden boy stumbles? What happens when Dutch's gaze, once fixed on John, begins to drift toward a louder, more dangerous disciple? The fall from that height will not just bruise pride. It will shatter the family Dutch spent decades pretending to build. Dutch's gaze does not drift into emptiness. It lands on new flames around the same fire, on men who will one day stand opposite John Marston with guns drawn. Before they become wanted posters and mission objectives, they are simply more lost souls pulled into Dutch's orbit, each one a mirror, a rival, and in the truest sense, a brother. Javier Escuela arrives first, a charismatic Mexican revolutionary turned outlaw, carrying the dust of failed uprisings on his boots. He has fought for grand speeches and broken promises, watched generals talk of freedom while peasants starved. Dutch's philosophy, that the world is rigged and civilization is a lie, sounds painfully familiar. Around the campfire, Javier and John share stories of homelands that use them and cast them aside, John's half-remembered Scotland and Ireland through his father. Javier's Mexico burning under corrupt regimes. Both know exile, both know betrayal. That shared wound becomes a bond. On long rides through snow and sagebrush, Javier teaches John Spanish curses and old revolutionary songs, laughing when John mangles the words. John answers with dry jabs and half-serious questions about what freedom ever really meant to men born poor. It is a story of two young outlaws trying to pretend they are still idealistic, still fighting for something more than money. Dutch listens, pleased. To him, Javier is the living embodiment of rebellion, proof that his philosophy stretches beyond America's borders. Then comes Bill Williamson, and the tone around the fire shifts. Bill is an ex-soldier, discharged in disgrace, carrying more scars on the inside than the outside. He drinks too much, talks too loud, and swings between desperate loyalty and sudden rage. Where Javier brings romance and politics, Bill brings raw volatility. Yet even he is not the brute the future will remember at the very beginning. At first, he is simply a man who wants to belong. Bill watches John closely. John is younger but more composed, more trusted. The one Dutch praises in front of the others. That cuts. So Bill rides harder, shoots faster, volunteers for every dangerous job. On a freezing night after an ambush goes wrong, it is John who drags Bill back through the dark, cursing him the whole way. Bill never forgets. Admiration and resentment fuse together, brotherhood and rivalry in the same breath. Through robberies in nameless towns, ambushes on lonely trails, and endless evenings of shared cigarettes and quiet laughter, these men become John's world. Dutch calls them family, repeats it until the word sounds holy. They bleed together, bury together, and dream together, even as the old ways were dying around them and the world was changing faster than any of them understand. So when Red Dead Redemption begins and John rides toward Fort Mercer, he is not just hunting Bill Williamson. He is riding toward a man who once tried to impress him, who once trusted him. When he tracks Javier through the jungle, every shouted threat carries the echo of old campfire songs. Every future gunfight is loaded with this unseen history, with half-remembered promises and jokes told under starlight. Each bullet tearing through a past that refuses to stay buried. The world was changing long before John Marston ever rode toward Fort Mercer or Nuevo Paraíso. While he was still a teenager in Dutch's care, the land itself began to shift under the gang's feet, turning their story from its humble beginnings as wandering outlaws into a confrontation with something bigger than any posse or Pinkerton. Steel was the first omen. New rail lines carved through forests and prairies the gang had once treated as endless. iron tracks cutting straight across old hunting grounds and hidden trails. Trains that had once been rare, almost mythical sights became a daily thunder on the horizon, smoke columns replacing mountain peaks as the tallest things in view. Little whistle-stop towns where Dutch and Hosea had once charmed drunk farmers now grew into small cities, with brick storefronts, electric lamps, and banks guarded by men in proper uniforms instead of sleepy sheriffs dozing on porches. Then came the wires. Telegraph poles marched across the horizon in rigid lines, wooden soldiers carrying messages faster than any horse could ride. A robbery in one county could reach a marshal 3 counties over before the gang even cleared the next ridge. What had once been a story of distance and delay, of outlaws vanishing into the gaps between slow-moving lawmen, became a race against invisible signals and organized responses. Dutch saw all of this as an encroaching enemy. To him, those trains were not just machines. They were the living embodiment of money, law, and control, roaring straight through the heart of the frontier. Those wires were chains. Those growing towns were cages with church bells. In his philosophy, the old ways were dying, strangled by bankers, politicians, and industrialists who wanted every acre mapped, taxed, and tamed. Freedom, in the truest sense, could not survive under timetables and ledgers. The gang's work changed because of it. Stagecoaches carrying loose cash gave way to armored safes on locomotives. Local posses became coordinated task forces, bolstered by federal marshals and Pinkerton agents who could share names, descriptions, and sightings almost instantly. Wealth no longer sat in a saloon owner's strongbox. It flowed through banks, rail depots, and corporate offices. Each job demanded more planning, more risk, and brought harsher consequences when things went wrong. For John, still young and impressionable, this new world was confusing. Part of him was curious about the cities, the machines, the ordered streets where families strolled without fear of wolves or bandits. What would it feel like to live in a place where survival did not depend on a gun and a fast horse? Yet his loyalty to Dutch ran deeper than that curiosity. Dutch framed civilization as a great betrayal of the human spirit, a polite prison built by cowards, and John accepted it. If Dutch said the future was a cage, then John would ride against it with a smile. The irony is that this same boy would one day try to live inside that cage. He would take a bank loan, sign a government contract, and build a ranch under those same wires and tracks, haunted by everything he had done to resist that world, and by the man who taught him to hate it. And that tension, between the outlaw Dutch maid and the husband and father John tried to become, was already taking root long before Blackwater. That tension did not stay abstract for long. It began to take on faces, names, and dollar amounts. It began to stare back from paper. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had mostly been a rumor, a story told in saloons about a fast-talking philosopher and his boys robbing trains in the night. But as the railroads stretched further and the banks grew fatter, civilization hired something new to defend itself. Not marshals bound by jurisdiction, not posses thrown together for a weekend. A private army with a badge and a ledger. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of the New World Dutch claimed to hate. It was corporate law, law for hire, law stripped of romance. Railroads, banks, and industrial barons paid retainers so that men in suits could hunt men in dusters, compiling files, tracking habits, learning routes. The old ways were dying, and this was what replaced them: ledgers instead of legends. The gang first heard the name whispered after a job on the rails went too smoothly. Too much money. Too little resistance. Within weeks, riders reported strangers in tailored coats asking careful questions, showing sketches, offering rewards. Who were these men who did not drink with the locals? Who wrote everything down? Who remembered every answer? Then the paper arrived. Wanted posters. At first, they were almost flattering in their inaccuracy. Crude charcoal smears tacked to telegraph poles and sheriff's boards. Dutch Van der Linde. Hosea Matthews. Unknown associates. But the posters kept coming, and the drawings improved, and the names multiplied. Arthur's jaw. Bill's bulk. Javier's hat. And then, one day, John's scar. John Marston, the paper read, the letters heavy with authority. His age was wrong. His height off by an inch, but the crooked line across his cheek was unmistakable. A boy who had once been shot in the face and left to die was now worth hard money to anyone willing to drag him in. Dead or alive. For Dutch, this was proof, not danger. Was this not a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family important enough to terrify the powerful? If the Pinkertons were coming, then the gang mattered. If civilization put a price on their heads, then their philosophy was working. Around the campfire, Dutch held the posters up like trophies, declaring that the world was changing because of them. For John, the feeling was more complicated. There was a thrill, of course, a teenager's rush at seeing his name printed, at knowing that somewhere men cursed when they heard it. What restless boy, abandoned and beaten, would not feel a spark of pride at being feared? But beneath that pride was a quieter dread. Once the world knew his face, how could he ever walk through it as anything but an outlaw? How did a wanted man become a husband, a father, a rancher under those wires and tracks? The answer did not come from Dutch. It came from a stranger in a dark coat, standing in a cramped frontier office, pinning John's poster to a sheriff's board. The Pinkerton smoothed the paper, studied the scar, and spoke to no one in particular. "Marston," he said. "This one. Dead or alive." Then he turned toward the door, already planning the hunt. The poster on the sheriff's wall promised money for John Marston's death. Back at camp, under a different sky and a different fire, Dutch still promised a future for his life. Between those two promises, the first cracks began to show. Around the flames, Dutch held court. He spoke of the world as a rigged game, of civilization as a cage, of their little band as the living embodiment of freedom in the truest sense. It sounded grand. It always did. Yet there were nights when John, older now and carrying more blood on his hands than most grown men, let the words hang in the air a moment longer than before, and quietly asked the question no one wanted voiced. "So when does it end, Dutch? When do we stop running?" It was not a challenge, not from its humble beginnings. It was a boy asking a father when they finally reach home. Dutch would smile, refill his pipe, and spin the answer into philosophy. The world was changing, he would say. The old ways were dying. First, they had to take enough from the rich to buy land, to build a place where the law could not touch them. Every robbery was a brick in that invisible house. Every dead deputy, every burned coach, a necessary sacrifice on the road to peace. The trouble was, the road never straightened. Jobs went wrong. A bank clerk caught in Javier's line of fire, gasping on a polished floor that smelled of ink and fear. A ranch hand trampled when Arthur spooked a horse during a hurried getaway. In those moments, the smoke and noise cleared, and John saw not enemies of freedom, but people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He did not make speeches. He made comments, low and sharp, telling Javier that the clerk had begged, asking Arthur why the ranch hand had to die over a payroll that barely fed the camp for a month. Sometimes it flared into argument, Arthur reminding him this was the life, Javier insisting that hesitation would get them all killed. Sometimes it ended in silence, with John staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Dutch never let that silence linger. He would step in, arm around John's shoulder, voice soft. They were building something, he insisted. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions perhaps, but also of family rescued from a cruel world. One day, when they had their land and their freedom, there would be no more need for blood. Part of John wanted to believe. He loved Dutch, loved the gang that had dragged him from orphanages and alleys, and made him feel less a lost soul and more a son. Yet his own story kept intruding. Starvation, cages, a drunken father dying over a prostitute, a boy shot in the face and left in the mud. Every perfect promise sounded strangely familiar, another man telling him salvation was just one more job away. So the doubt that grew in him was crooked, difficult to name. Was he beginning to question Dutch's grand design? Or was he only questioning whether he deserved the future Dutch described at all, whether a scarred outlaw could ever truly belong in the family he had been told was his only chance at redemption? Around the campfire, the laughter went on, the plans grew bolder, and John's questions, still soft and infrequent, began to follow Dutch's speeches like a shadow that would not quite disappear. Those questions in John's mind did not stop the work. If anything, they made him sharper. The gang's talk around the fire about freedom and family always ended in the same place. Another job, another plan, another chance to prove Dutch's philosophy in the only currency the dying West respected: violence and money. from its humble beginnings robbing stagecoaches and small-town stores. The van der Linde gang graduated to the kind of scores that carved legends into the frontier. Trains first. Dutch loved trains because they were, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of civilization cutting across the old ways. A train meant schedules, payrolls, armored cars. It also meant soldiers, Pinkertons, and passengers who did not always scare easy. John learned to move along the roof in the dark, to blow a lock without derailing the whole thing, to cover the doors while Hosea coaxed the safe. Planning, timing, discipline, every mile of track became a classroom. Banks came next, when Dutch wanted to prove the gang was more than just bandits in the wilderness. A bank job required a different precision. John stood at the front with a shotgun, voice steady, eyes colder than his years. Intimidation was a weapon, and he learned to use it without shouting. One wrong move, one clerk reaching for a hidden pistol, and that calm turned to gunfire. Each robbery honed his ability to read a room, to know who would break, who would fight, and who would try to be a hero. Then there were the quiet crimes no one boasted about at camp. High-risk kidnappings of railroad men, mine foremen, or local politicians whose disappearance could be turned into quick cash or leverage. John rode escort on those nights, keeping a gun on the hostage while Dutch spun grand speeches about progress and greed. It was a story of resistance and extortion, of dreams and delusions braided together so tightly that even the captor sometimes forgot which was which. Somewhere in those unseen years came the first time John shot to kill. Not in a noble duel at high noon, but in a muddy alley behind a depot, when a guard reached for his whistle and John's hand moved faster than his conscience. The man fell, choking on blood and dirt. Dutch clapped John on the shoulder, called it necessary, called it justice. The world was changing, Dutch said, and the old ways were dying. Sentiment had no place in a war. The first dead partner followed not long after. A younger recruit, nervous on a train roof, slipped when the dynamite went off and vanished under the wheels. For a moment, everything stopped. Then, Dutch shouted for the gang to move, to ride, to live, so the sacrifice meant something. Grief was folded into the legend, buried beneath the promise that it all served a greater good. By the time civilization finally caught up with John Marston in Red Dead Redemption, those years had done their work. The calm under pressure, the deadly accuracy, the tactical sense that lets him read a battlefield at a glance, none of it appeared overnight. It was forged in smoke-filled cars, echoing vaults, and lonely roads ridden at a gallop with a terrified hostage in tow. Every successful escape confirmed Dutch's belief that they were chosen. Every close call taught John how fragile that belief really was. In the end, every legendary gunslinger on the frontier stood on a pile of unnamed bodies and forgotten jobs. John was no exception. He was their sum, a lost soul turned into a weapon, carrying scars that did not show on his face, only in the way his hand never shook when the gun came up, and in the long, heavy silences that followed when the shooting finally stopped. For a long time, those silences were all John had. Empty nights after bloody work, a blanket near the edge of camp, and the vague comfort of Dutch's approval drifting through the smoke. Then, in a world built on transaction and pretense, he met someone who had seen the same darkness from the other side of the fire. Abigail Roberts did not arrive as a romantic figure. She came as labor, a camp prostitute, taken in young, passed from hand to hand among outlaws who talked about freedom and family while treating her as part of the provisions. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and world-weary beyond her years, the living embodiment of what Dutch's philosophy looked like when the speeches ended and the money changed hands. Men called her girl as if that made the bruises smaller. She did not forget a single name. From the very beginning, Abigail refused to be just a victim of her circumstances. She learned who held the ledgers, who held the guns, who held the secrets. She watched Susan Grimshaw enforce rules that never quite protected her, listened to Dutch preach about civilization crushing the weak, and understood that in this story, weakness was simply whatever the strong decided it was. She smoked, she swore, she bargained, she endured, and she took careful note of which men apologized after using her, and which did not. John and Abigail connected first in sarcasm, not tenderness. Two people who had both been used by those who claimed to care, trading barbs over the fire while the rest of the gang drank and laughed. He had been the golden boy outlaw, the surrogate son Dutch paraded as proof that his wayward philosophy could save a lost soul. She had been the unspoken cost of that dream, the person no one mentioned when they praised Dutch's ideals. Who understood that better than them? They shared stories of orphanages and alleys, of being hungry and being afraid, of learning to make fear disappear behind a crooked grin. John saw that Abigail did not flinch at his scars or at the things he had done. Abigail saw that John's loyalty to Dutch was not blind. It was wounded, complicated, already fraying at the edges. In each other, they found a mirror and a possible way out. Dutch tolerated the relationship at first. He joked about young love, teased John, told Abigail she was part of the family, in the truest sense now. But behind the smiles there was a tightening, a quiet resentment. Dutch's grand design required devotion to the gang as an idea, not to any single person. Every moment John spent by the fire with Abigail was a moment not spent at Dutch's side, absorbing his speeches about the world changing and the old ways dying. As Abigail's belly began to swell, John's roles collided. Golden boy, enforcer, surrogate son, partner, potential father. Each demanded a different version of him, and none could fully coexist. How could he be the fearless gun Dutch needed, the obedient child Dutch expected, and the steady man Abigail and a baby would require, all at once? For the first time, John had something to lose that was not measured in Dutch's approval or the gang's praise. It was measured in a small, fragile future that did not fit inside Dutch's dream. And in a camp full of wolves, everyone could smell that change on him long before the first real test arrived. In a camp full of wolves, change did not go unnoticed. And John's new sense of responsibility drew attention from the one man who understood it best, Arthur. Their bond had begun as a rivalry, a story of two favored sons circling the same fire, but danger has a way of sanding down pride. Bullets, blizzards, and bad plans did what Dutch's speeches never could. They forced John and Arthur to trust each other. On long rides to collect debts or scout a town, the insults came first. Arthur calling John a reckless fool, John firing back that Arthur was Dutch's obedient hound. Yet when the shooting started, those words vanished. There was the ambush in the Grizzlies, when John's horse went down on a snowy ridge and O'Driscoll rifles opened up from the rocks. Arthur did not hesitate. He hauled John behind cover, shared his last cartridges, and the two of them fought back to back until the valley fell silent. In that frozen echo, rivalry felt very small. From its humble beginnings, this was how their brotherhood grew, not through tenderness, but through shared survival. Arthur showed John how to read tracks in the mud, how to gut a deer clean so the meat would last, how to move through timber without giving away a silhouette. John listened, argued, then copied every motion. Their conversations veered between mentorship and mockery, between hard-earned wisdom and sharp jabs about women, money, and Dutch's grand philosophy. There were nights by the fire when Arthur defended that philosophy in the truest sense. Dutch, he insisted, was fighting for freedom in a world that had already decided men like them were expendable. Civilization was a cage. Dutch was the key. John, staring into the flames, began to ask quieter questions. If Dutch's plans were so righteous, why did they so often end with someone dead and the gang running? How many more one last scores would it take to buy a future for Abigail and Jack? The pattern broke in a way no one expected. The real wedge between them was not a gunfight or a pile of money. It was family. Arthur's friendship with Abigail and his quiet affection for Jack made him the living embodiment of John's better instincts. When Dutch demanded John ride out on some reckless errand, and Abigail stood her ground, Arthur sometimes sided with her. He would tell John to think, to stay alive, to remember the boy asleep in the wagon rather than the dream in Dutch's head. That loyalty web grew tangled. Arthur still believed in Dutch's ideals, yet his actions increasingly protected John's family over Dutch's pride. John saw it, even when he pretended not to. Their bond, forged in sarcasm and shared bloodshed, was becoming something dangerous, a competing center of gravity inside the gang. And soon, when John vanished on the eve of Blackwater, Arthur would be forced to decide which gravity to follow, the man who raised him, or the brother who walked away. John's disappearance before Blackwater left a fracture in the gang. Blackwater itself would turn that fracture into a fault line. Because Blackwater was not the wilderness they knew, it was the edge of a new world, the living embodiment of a civilization that no longer needed men like them. From its humble beginnings as a river town, Blackwater had grown into something almost unrecognizable to an outlaw raised under open skies. The streets were cleaner, laid out in neat grids. Electric lamps burned away the darkness where campfires once ruled the night. Brick buildings rose where clapboard shacks might have stood, and men in pressed suits talked about railroads, investments, and futures that stretched into the 20th century. The world was changing, and Blackwater was proof. For the Vanderlinde gang, it was both opportunity and warning. They did not ride in to rob a dusty coach or terrorize a rural bank. Here, they studied train schedules, watched ferry manifests, and listened in saloons where lawyers, speculators, and government men bragged too loudly after a few drinks. Their robberies became more sophisticated, more precise, and far more dangerous. This was no longer a story of rough men taking from rougher men. This was a story of predators circling the polished heart of a new economy. There was situational irony in it all. Men who could barely read discussing stock certificates they planned to steal. Outlaws in worn coats brushing shoulders with bankers who had never fired a gun. Some nights, Dutch and Hosea played cards with the very sort of people they claimed to despise, memorizing faces and routines, turning civility into reconnaissance. John felt the pull of the place more than most. After years of mud, snow, and hunger, Blackwater's comfort struck him in the truest sense. Warm rooms without smoke choking the air. Hot baths that did not depend on a nearby river. Shops where Abigail could buy decent clothes, where Jack might one day hold a book that was not water-damaged or stolen. Was this what stability looked like? Was this what freedom could be when it did not come at the end of a gun? Yet every polished surface made him uneasy. The order here was not natural. It was enforced by money, lawmen, and the quiet threat of the federal government. An outlaw's instincts told him that places this tidy hid rot beneath the floorboards. The old ways were dying, but what replaced them did not feel merciful. It felt colder, more efficient, and far less forgiving. Dutch saw something else. To him, Blackwater was the final stepping stone to his grand philosophy. One last. Perfect score that would buy passage to Tahiti or some other imagined paradise where the gang could live as a family beyond the reach of civilization. He spoke of ships, of orchards, of freedom without compromise. Each electric light in Blackwater became, in his mind, a beacon pointing toward escape. But beneath the plans, a storm was gathering. The Pinkertons were watching. The government was listening. And somewhere in the gap between Dutch's dreams and Blackwater's reality, something in John began to crack. Before the ferry, before the blood in the water, before the gang's illusion of invincibility shattered, John's faith in Dutch's promised future quietly began to die. John's faith in Dutch began to die in silence, and then in the most unexpected way. It was reborn into something far more frightening: fatherhood. The story of John Marston as an outlaw could not be separated from the story of John Marston as a father, because the moment Jack was born, every promise Dutch had ever made suddenly had a witness. Jack came into the world not in a quiet farmhouse or a clean town doctor's office, but in the orbit of the Vanderlinde gang. Abigail was still working, still moving between bedrolls and saloons, still treated by many in camp as a convenience rather than a mother. When the baby's cries began to echo through canvas tents and smoke-stained wagons, the gang did not become a family overnight. It became a camp of thieves and killers trying, awkwardly, to pretend they knew what to do with a child. There was a strange, almost dark humor in watching men who could rob a train without blinking fumble with a crying infant. Bill Williamson holding Jack like a lit stick of dynamite. Javier strumming a quiet tune, hoping music might calm a child born into gunfire and gallows talk. Susan Grimshaw barking orders about boiled water and clean rags, as if organizing a robbery. From its humble beginnings as a band of idealistic outlaws, the gang now had something it had never truly prepared for: a future that could not carry a gun. John's reaction was not joy. It was fear, avoidance, and denial. He had been the boy whose father drank himself into a wheelchair and then into an early grave in a bar fight. He had been the child shot in the face during a robbery, abandoned and scarred. In his mind, he was the living embodiment of every failure a man could hand down to a son. So he rode out on longer jobs, volunteered for riskier work, stayed away from the cradle as if his presence alone might poison it. How could a lost soul raise anything but another? Abigail saw it clearly. She wanted stability, a roof that did not move every few months, a world where her child's first words were not learned over the sound of gunfire. She had believed Dutch's talk of freedom and family, but now Dutch's philosophy looked less like protection and more like a cage. Every time Dutch pulled John away for another job, every time the camp laughed off John's distance as men being men, Abigail's frustration hardened into anger. Who was really stealing Jack's future, the law outside or the gang inside? Dutch framed Jack in his own grand terms. To him, this was another child of the gang, another soul they had saved from civilization's hypocrisy. He bounced the boy on his knee, spoke of teaching him to read, to think, to question, just as he had with Arthur and John. But beneath the tenderness lay an expectation. Jack would grow up in this life, not beyond it. The old ways were dying, Dutch insisted, but their camp would stand apart. A story of freedom in the truest sense. For John, that promise now sounded hollow. He stood at a crossroads between three roles that refused to fit together: Dutch's son, the gang's outlaw, and Jack's father. Each demanded a different loyalty. Each carried a different betrayal. As Jack's small hand wrapped around his finger, John began to understand that one of those roles would have to be abandoned. The question was which one, and how far he would run when the time came. Because before Blackwater, before government agents and ultimatums, John Marston's first disappearance would not be from the law at all. It would be from his own family. John's first true act of betrayal does not come with a gun in his hand, but with an empty space where he used to stand. One morning, long before Blackwater, before Pinkertons and trains, John Marston simply vanishes from camp, leaving behind a woman, a baby, and a question that will haunt every person who loved him. Why did he run? Canon gives only the outline. Sometime before 1899, after Jack is born and the gang has begun to feel the pressure of civilization closing in, John disappears for almost a year. He leaves Abigail to raise their son among outlaws. He abandons the daily grind of robberies, relocations, and Dutch's speeches. Then, just as suddenly, he returns, bruised and gaunt, with no clear explanation beyond a few muttered lines about trying to make it on his own. It is a story of absence, told mostly through the scars it leaves on everyone else. From the very beginning, John's fear of becoming his father hangs over him. He grew up watching a drunk, crippled by a wagon accident, crawl toward one bad decision after another, until a bar fight finished the job. Dutch's camp offered an escape from that fate, a philosophy that promised freedom instead of failure. But as the gang ages, as jobs grow bloodier, and Dutch's idealistic talk hardens into delusions of grandeur, John starts to see echoes of that same ruin. What if the man who saved him is just another version of the man who destroyed his childhood? So he runs. Perhaps he chases the fantasy of honest work, trying ranches or stables, only to find that the world beyond the gang is no gentler. Employers cheat him, sheriffs already know his name, and the old ways were dying faster than he can adapt. Perhaps, when money runs short, he slips back into petty crime, robbing some poor traveler who turns out to be just as desperate as he is. Two men with empty pockets and shaking hands, each trying to rob the other, the living embodiment of Dutch's claim that the system is rigged for everyone. Back in camp, his absence becomes a mirror. Arthur sees a coward who fled his responsibilities, proof that John's talk of family was thinner than smoke. Dutch calls it ingratitude, a betrayal of everything he gave that boy from the orphanage, and he folds that hurt into his growing paranoia. Abigail reads it the most personally. If John could walk away once, what is to stop him from doing it again? Her trust fractures, and with it, the fragile dream of a real home for Jack. When John finally returns, he is thinner, quieter, and humbled, his confidence beaten down by a world that offered no easy redemption. He comes back hoping for forgiveness, hoping the gang will close around him as it did when he was 12. Instead, he finds smiles that do not reach the eyes, a son who barely knows him, and a family that has turned his absence into a wound. The first betrayal has already been written, the next ones are only a matter of time. John's return should have been a homecoming. Instead, it felt like a trial. Arthur is the first real verdict. The man who once treated John as a kid brother now meets him with a stare that could cut through leather. His words are cold, edged with that dry, bitter sarcasm that hurts more than a beating. When John stumbles back into camp after months away, Arthur does not ask where he has been. He asks why Abigail had to raise Jack alone. To Arthur, the answer is simple: John ran. He abandoned his family and his family of outlaws in the truest sense. This reaction does not come from nowhere. Arthur watched Abigail cry, watched Jack ask where his father had gone, watched Dutch spin stories about loyalty while one of their own disappeared into the wilderness. In Arthur's mind, John's vanishing act confirms every fear about him being reckless, selfish, still that half-formed boy Dutch took in from its humble beginnings. So when John tries to explain, Arthur cuts him off with a scoff, a muttered remark about men who talk big about freedom but vanish when responsibility comes calling. The hurt is personal, but it is also philosophical. Dutch's response is more complicated, and in some ways more dangerous. On the surface, he welcomes John back. There is a hand on the shoulder, a practiced smile, a speech about second chances. But beneath that charm sits wounded pride. Dutch has built a world on the idea that his gang is the living embodiment of loyalty, a story of chosen family standing against a corrupt civilization. John's disappearance is a crack in that story, and Dutch cannot let it be his fault. So he turns it into a lesson. John is told he must prove himself again, that trust has to be earned, that betrayal will not be forgotten. Every time John hesitates, Dutch can point back. Remember when you left? Remember who took you in from the very beginning? In Dutch's hands, the past becomes a moral cudgel, a quiet reminder that John owes him everything and has already failed once. Overnight, John's status shifts. The former golden boy, the brash young enforcer Dutch, once paraded as proof of his philosophy, becomes a man under suspicion. Where Dutch once boasted about John's promise, he now watches him more closely, asks more questions, trusts him a little less. Around the campfire, that change is felt. Some follow Dutch's lead, treating John as a liability. Others sense that something in the family bond has curdled. John feels it all. He carries the guilt of Abigail's anger and Jack's confusion, remembering nights when his son barely recognized him. But he also bristles at being treated as a wayward child, begging to rejoin a life of robbery and murder. Is this freedom? Or just another prison with prettier words? The world was changing. The old ways were dying. Yet Dutch clings to his own myth so fiercely that any challenge feels like treason. That first fracture will not heal. Years later, when Blackwater goes wrong and the Pinkertons close in, Dutch will reach back to this moment, to this betrayal, to justify every cold decision he makes about John Marston. And the next time Dutch decides John has failed him, the consequences will be far deadlier. That first fracture between Dutch and John does not heal, and in the middle of it all stands Hosea Matthews, the last steady hand on a ship already drifting toward the rocks. He has seen Dutch angry, stubborn, proud, but this is different. This is Dutch hardening, turning a wounded ego into a philosophy of grievance. Hosea does what he has always done. He mediates. Around the fire, on quiet rides, in the half-lit spaces between jobs, he urges Dutch, Arthur, and John toward forgiveness. He reminds Dutch that a family held together by grudges is not a family at all, only a gang of armed strangers. He tells Arthur that John is still a boy in many ways, that betrayal and disappointment are part of growing up. He tells John that Dutch is flawed, not faithless, and that walking away in anger will only poison every dream of freedom they ever shared. But the world was changing, and Dutch was changing with it. From its humble beginnings as a partnership of two conmen who argued over which rich fool to rob, the Van der Linde outfit has become a small, moving civilization of outlaws. And Dutch now believes he is the living embodiment of its destiny. Hosea's cautious plans, his insistence on patience and low-risk scores, start to sound to Dutch like fear rather than wisdom. In council after council, the pattern shifts. Dutch talks first, talks louder, talks longer. Hosea waits, interjects, suggests a safer route, a smaller take, a cleaner exit, and Dutch brushes it aside with a grand speech about progress, about striking a blow against civilization. The old ways were dying, he insists, and only bold men will survive the new world. What place is there for a tired grifter's doubts in a story of revolution and legend? For John, that change is deeply personal. Hosea is not just the co-leader. He is the one man John can speak to without performance. Around Hosea, John admits his fears about Abigail, his worry that Jack will grow up an orphan in the truest sense, his suspicion that Dutch's plans are becoming less about helping the family and more about proving a point to a world that stopped listening. Hosea listens. He does not condemn John's doubts. He quietly warns him that men who cannot be questioned are men who will eventually be fled or buried. Here lies the tragedy. As Hosea's voice grows quieter in those camp councils, the gang loses its moral break, and John loses the mentor who might have steered him toward another path. Each time Dutch chooses Micah's daring over Hosea's restraint, each time Arthur stays silent rather than backing the old man, the balance tips further. The gang still calls itself a family, but its conscience is being voted down. And somewhere ahead, in a city of electric lights and marble banks, Hosea's voice will be silenced for good. When that happens, it will not just be a death. It will be the final erasing of the part of the gang that could still change, leaving Dutch, Arthur, and John to face a future with no one left to say, "Enough, who will they become without him?" When Hosea's voice is gone, something else grows louder. Dutch's. The speeches that once shared the stage with quiet doubt now echo alone, repeated so often they start to sound rehearsed. From the very beginning, Dutch's words had been the living embodiment of the gang's dreams. Freedom from civilization's chains. Family against a corrupt world. We are not criminals, he would insist. We are outlaws, in the truest sense. John heard those lines as a half-starved teenager and believed every syllable. Years later, at Horseshoe Overlook and Clements Point, the phrases are almost unchanged. Only the man behind them is. Dutch still talks about rescuing the downtrodden, still frames every robbery as a blow against the rich and the corrupt. But the targets shift. Banks instead of backroom card sharps. Armored stages instead of crooked sheriffs. Each job grows riskier, more theatrical, less concerned with who gets hurt in the crossfire. The old ways were dying, and Dutch decides the only answer is to shout louder, to double down on the philosophy even as he drifts further from it. John notices in moments others miss. He remembers the Dutch who pulled him off a noose, who preached that no one in the family was expendable. Then Guarma happens. Sean is dead. Hosea is dead. Lenny is dead. In Saint Denis, Dutch had promised a careful, civilized bank job, a clean score that would set them free. What John gets is chaos, civilians screaming, Pinkertons swarming, friends cut down on marble steps while Dutch rants about progress and betrayal. Afterward, when John questions the wisdom of going back into a city crawling with law, Dutch does not answer with reason. He answers with anger. How dare John doubt him? Has John forgotten who saved him? The man who once encouraged questions now treats them as treason. Each challenge from John is met with wounded pride, with that familiar line, "Have some goddamn faith." Faith, in this case, means silence. At Shady Bell, and later Beaver Hollow, the pattern hardens. Dutch speaks of family, then abandons John in the Saint Denis streets, leaving him bleeding and captured. He speaks of loyalty, then entertains Micah's whispers about John being weak, distracted by Abigail and Jack. He speaks of freedom, then marches the gang into deals with men like Angelo Bronte and Colonel Favors, turning his revolution into a series of desperate, self-serving gambles. This is a story of a man repeating the same sermon while changing the collection plate. The philosophy remains poetic, the applications grow cruel. John, who has heard this voice since adolescence, begins to hear the seams, the pauses, the way Dutch invokes family most fiercely when he needs someone to die for him. By the time the gang is rotting in the caves of Beaver Hollow, Dutch's speeches are no longer scripture to John. They are sales pitches, and with every broken promise, the product gets worse, the cost higher, and the guarantee of freedom more obviously a delusion. How long can a lost soul keep buying what he knows no longer exists? Saint Denis is where Dutch's sermons about civilization finally grow a body. Smokestacks instead of pines, streetcars instead of stagecoaches, electric light burning the night out of existence. The city is the living embodiment of the modern world he always warned about, humming with factories, choked with carriages, and crowded with a dense, uneasy mix of classes and cultures pressed together on narrow streets. For John, stepping into Saint Denis is stepping into the future and feeling it look back with cold curiosity. Men in bowler hats argue about stock prices beside dock workers unloading cargo from steamships, Wealthy matrons glide past Creole vendors and Chinese laborers, while newsboys shout headlines about progress and profit. The world was changing, and in Saint Denis that change is not a rumor at the edge of the horizon. It is deafening, visible, inescapable. Dutch talks about it as a battlefield of ideas, a story of freedom against control, of wild spirit against suffocating order. John feels something much simpler: wrong. The cobblestones feel too clean, the alleys too tight, the air too thick with coal and perfume. When he pulls on a tailored suit for a job, the cloth itches his skin and his conscience in equal measure. He moves through parlors and banking halls with his shoulders tight, suspicious of every polite smile, every soft voice that hides a harder kind of cruelty than a gun. And yet, there is temptation here. Anonymity. A man can disappear in this crowd, not as a fugitive, but as a nobody. John watches nameless clerks shuffle papers, fathers walk children past toy shops, waiters who go home at night without blood on their hands. For the first time since the very beginning of his life with the gang, he can picture Jack somewhere that gunfire is only a distant echo, where the loudest sound is a streetcar bell. Could his son belong in a world where his father never quite could? Dutch's reaction is more complicated and more dangerous. He despises the city's bankers and politicians, calls them parasites feeding on the poor. The old ways were dying because of men in silk gloves. But he also covets everything he claims to hate: the wealth, the power, the deference. Saint Denis becomes his proof that the system is rigged and his excuse to strike at it, even as he lounges in its finest bars and plots in its most expensive rooms. Here, John's internal conflict sharpens into something almost painful. Loyalty pulls him toward Dutch. Responsibility pulls him toward Abigail and Jack. Between freedom and civilization, which is the real prison? He cannot yet imagine leaving the gang, yet he cannot unsee what a different life might be. A small ranch, honest work, riding into a town as a customer, not an outlaw. That dream will not fit inside Dutch's philosophy. It can only exist after the gang is gone. Saint Denis is not just a backdrop in this tale. It is a mirror, held up to every lost soul in the Van der Linde gang, reflecting what they are and what they will never be. Saint Denis had shown John the future. Guarma would show him the breaking point. When the bank job in Saint Denis collapses in gunfire and chaos, the gang does not simply flee. It is erased. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, and a handful of others are swept out of America on a stolen boat, chased into the storm, shipwrecked on a tropical island that might as well be another world. John, wounded and separated during the escape, is left behind with those who do not make that mad voyage. For the men on the boat, he is probably dead. For John, the man who once saved him has vanished into the ocean. Guarma is a fever dream in the middle of a dying frontier, a story of revolution and exploitation far from the familiar plains. Dutch inserts himself into another doomed struggle, promising freedom to local rebels, spinning the same philosophy in a new language. He is still the living embodiment of his own legend, even as the world was changing and the old ways were dying behind him in America. Yet every step he takes on that island is built on an absence. The son he assumes is gone. The family he believes has been thinned by fate rather than by his own delusions. From John's perspective, the symmetry is brutal. Years ago, he disappeared from the gang, wounded and half feral, and Dutch never forgave him for it. Now Dutch is the one who vanishes, chasing a fantasy across the sea and leaving John once more to bleed out under the weight of someone else's plan. How many times can a father figure walk away before the son stops waiting at the door? When Dutch finally returns from Guarma, gaunt and haunted, he does not speak of abandonment. He speaks of destiny. John survives, of course, only to be captured by the law and hauled away in chains. Dutch does not see resilience, he sees failure. In his mind, a man truly loyal would have died free rather than be taken. John's survival becomes evidence of weakness, and his arrest becomes a quiet accusation. Had John talked? Had he hesitated? Had he, in some hidden way, chosen civilization over freedom? Dutch never asks directly. He simply lets the doubt sit there, poisoning everything. The emotional balance between them flips. Just as Dutch carried a private ledger of John's old disappearance, John now carries Guarma as a permanent mark against Dutch. The shipwreck, the lies, the bodies left on a foreign shore. and then Dutch returning to camp as if the philosophy still held, as if nothing fundamental had changed. In the truest sense, something had. The father-son bond that began from its humble beginnings on dusty trails is now stretched past its limit. What remains is obligation, fear, and shared crimes, not unshakable love. The question is no longer whether John will follow Dutch. It is how long he can keep pretending to. Obligation, fear, and shared crimes, that is all that holds John now. Into that hollowed space, another man steps. Micah Bell does not arrive as a son in need of guidance. He arrives as an answer to Dutch's wounded pride, the living embodiment of everything Dutch has begun to value more than conscience, decisiveness, brutality, and unflinching praise. From the very beginning of Micah's time with the gang, his role is clear. Where others debate, he pushes. Where others hesitate, he fires. He flatters Dutch's philosophy as if it were scripture, telling him that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and only Dutch is wise enough to see it. Every reckless plan becomes destiny. Every dead civilian becomes necessary. Micah's words drip with admiration, but underneath them is poison. The contrast with John could not be sharper. John still questions. He argues after Colm's hanging, after Cornwall's men are gunned down in the streets, after innocents are dragged into a story of dreams and delusions. He wants freedom, but he also wants Abigail and Jack to survive. For Dutch, that hesitation now sounds like betrayal. For Micah, it is an opportunity. When Dutch asks for loyalty, John brings concerns. Micah brings a loaded gun and a nod. As Dutch grows more paranoid, the binary becomes simple in his mind. Those who doubt him and those who worship him. Arthur's conscience presses against Dutch's worst impulses, pulling him back from the brink, asking whether the gang has become no better than the civilization it claims to resist. Micah offers the opposite. He urges more violence, more risk, more suspicion. Pinkertons at every tree, traitors in every shadow. Each time Dutch's temper flares at John or Arthur, Micah is there, murmuring that the real problem is weakness. For John, watching this shift is its own quiet punishment. Once the reckless golden boy, once the surrogate son Dutch boasted about, he now stands at the edge of the firelight as Micah takes his seat near the center. Every whispered conversation between Dutch and Micah confirms a terrible realization. Years of loyalty can be replaced overnight. What is a decade of shared hunger and gunsmoke worth if a newer, more ruthless outlaw can say the right words? In the truest sense, John is forced to see Dutch's family for what it has become: conditional, transactional, held together not by love, but by usefulness. Micah's usefulness is simple. He will do anything. He will kill anyone. He will blame everyone except Dutch. And somewhere ahead, in cold mountain air, that poison will reach its peak. Dutch will stand between two men, one who questions him and one who praises him, and he will have to decide whose story to believe. When that moment comes, only one of them will walk away from the snow. The choice begins here, with a whisper at Dutch's ear. That whisper at Dutch's ear turns to a gunshot in Saint Denis. The bank job is supposed to be one more grand gesture, one more defiant stand against a world closing in. Instead, it becomes a public execution. Hosea Matthews, the man who stood beside Dutch from the very beginning, is dragged out into the street, unarmed. Surrounded by lawmen and Pinkertons who understand the power of a spectacle, they do not kill him in the shadows. They kill him where the whole city can watch. A shot rings out. Hosea falls. And with him, something far larger collapses. For the authorities, Hosea's death is more than punishment. It is a message carved into the air over Saint Denis. This is civilization, asserting itself over the outlaw dream, a reminder that the world was changing and the old ways were dying. The gang's silver-tongued negotiator, its conman philosopher, is reduced to a corpse on the cobblestones, displayed as proof that no speech, no plan, no charm can outtalk a rifle. John sees it happen in the chaos of the failed escape, and for a moment, time seems to fracture. Hosea, the man who taught him patience, who warned him to walk away, who spoke of freedom as something earned by surviving long enough to change, is simply gone. There is shock first, then grief, then a strange, hollow clarity. If the living embodiment of caution and restraint can be erased in a heartbeat, what chance does anyone else have? In that instant, Hosea's old warnings echo louder than the gunfire. Leave while there is still something to save. Do not mistake Dutch's dreams for reality. John had always half believed, half doubted. Now the balance tilts. The last man who could talk Dutch down will never speak again. Dutch's response is the true turning point. This could have been the moment he broke, admitted defeat, and led his family away. Instead, rage consumes him. Hosea's death does not humble Dutch, it sanctifies his paranoia. He turns grief into fuel, betrayal into prophecy, insisting that Hosea died because the world could not tolerate their philosophy, because loyalty demands they strike back harder, go bigger, trust him more blindly than ever. What had been a story of resistance and survival twists into a crusade. Every failure becomes proof that he is right. Every corpse becomes a martyr. Symbolically, Hosea's execution is the moral death of the gang. From its humble beginnings, there had always been at least one voice arguing that the life had to end someday. That family meant more than the next score. With that voice silenced, John's fragile hope for a peaceful exit darkens. Who is left to argue for Abigail and Jack now? Who is left to say that running is not betrayal, but mercy? From this point on, every decision is made by a man John no longer fully recognizes. Dutch still uses the same words: freedom, family, loyalty, but the meaning behind them has rotted. And as the gang stumbles toward the mountains in the snow, John begins to understand that surviving Dutch may be harder than surviving the law. Surviving Dutch is one thing. Realizing Dutch is the problem is another. That realization does not begin with John, it takes root in Arthur when death finally taps him on the shoulder. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis is the turning point, the crack that runs through the entire story of the gang. A coughing fit in the mud of St. Denis becomes a sentence he cannot appeal, forcing him to measure every choice against the little time he has left. The outlaw who once drifted from job to job now counts his remaining days, and in that harsh arithmetic, Dutch's grand philosophy begins to look painfully small. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's talk of freedom and family sounded idealistic, even noble. But as Arthur grows weaker, he watches Dutch grow harder, colder, more consumed by delusions of one last score that will fix everything. Each broken promise, each dead body, makes the pattern clear. The man Arthur once believed was the living embodiment of resistance has become a preacher of empty sermons, using the same words to justify cruelty that he once used to justify survival. In the truest sense, Arthur starts seeing what John had suspected since before Blackwater. Dutch's plans are no longer about saving anyone. They are about Dutch proving Dutch right. The speeches about civilization closing in, the rants about betrayal and loyalty, all of it becomes a mask for a wounded ego that refuses to admit failure. When Dutch leaves John in the gunfire in St. Denis, when he abandons the innocents in Guarma, Arthur finally understands that this is not leadership. It is fear wearing a familiar face. That understanding shifts Arthur's center of gravity. If Dutch will not protect the gang, someone else must. The man who once mocked John for wanting a quiet ranch now rides into danger to pull Abigail out of Sisika, stands between Jack and the worst of the world, and starts to see John not as a deserter, but as a chance for something to outlive all this blood. The conversations change. Around the campfire, on lonely rides back from doomed jobs, Arthur urges John to leave, to take Abigail and Jack and run before the noose tightens. He tells him to be a better father than the drunk who died in a bar fight, to break the cycle that turned two abandoned boys into hired guns. Is it betrayal to walk away, or is it the first honest act of loyalty John has ever been asked to perform? The irony is brutal. The man who once dragged John back to the gang at gunpoint now begs him to disappear. Arthur, the enforcer of Dutch's dream, becomes its quiet executioner, not with bullets, but with a plea: run. Run for Jack's sake. Run so that at least one lost soul in this collapsing world can be saved. And as Arthur's lungs fail and Dutch's schemes unravel, one question hangs in the air. Heavier than the smoke over Beaver Hollow, will John listen this time? John does listen. But the price of finally listening is almost everything he has ever known. The ride up into the mountains is desperate, thin air and thinner chances, the last remnants of an idealistic dream chased by the full weight of civilization. Pinkertons swarm the lower trails, their blue coats and iron badges climbing after the gang's ghosts, while Dutch's family splinters for the final time. What began as a story of loyalty and rebellion now narrows to a single question: who gets out alive? Arthur, already dying from the inside, feels the gang dying around him. Dutch rants about faith and betrayal, Micah whispers poison, and the very beginning of their philosophy, freedom, honor, a code, collapses under the sound of rifle fire echoing off the rock. In that chaos, Arthur does something unthinkable for the man who once dragged John back at gunpoint. He chooses John's life over his own. On the high ridge, where the snow turns red and the sky feels painfully close, Arthur turns his horse, presses the satchel and the truth into John's hands, and stays behind. He knows the Pinkertons are closing in. He knows Micah is hunting him. He knows Dutch is already gone in all but name. Yet he looks at John, the former golden boy, the repeat runaway, the man who failed his family once, and decides that this outlaw is still worth saving. For John, it is agony. Every instinct forged in the gang screams to stand, to fight, to refuse to abandon the man who became his harshest critic and, in the truest sense, his truest mirror. But then he thinks of Jack. He remembers growing up an orphan, a lost soul passed between an orphanage and the streets, shot in the face as a child, turned into a weapon by Dutch's charm and Hosea's patience. Does Jack deserve that same inheritance? Abigail's voice, frantic and furious, cuts through the gunfire. She rides ahead with Jack, the boy clinging to her, too young to understand that the world was changing behind him in that moment. John hesitates on the trail, eyes pulled back to where Arthur makes his last stand against Micah and Dutch's delusions, back to the collapsing myth of the gang from its humble beginnings to this frozen end. Then he forces his horse forward. He chooses his son. Arthur's final struggle on that mountaintop is more than a brawl between dying men. It is the living embodiment of a broken philosophy being buried so that something better might crawl out of the grave. By defying Dutch, by exposing Micah, by sending John away, Arthur insists that the old ways were dying for a reason, and that someone from this cursed family might still do right. As John rides down the mountain, Abigail and Jack are distant silhouettes against the fading light, and Arthur's fate is swallowed by the peaks above. Behind him, the Van der Linde gang still technically exists: Dutch, Micah, Javier, Bill, but in truth, it ends there in the snow. Ahead lies a ranch, a fragile hope, and a future that will demand its own terrible payment. John does find a ranch. He finds fences to mend, stalls to muck, and a bed that does not move with the wind. But freedom, in the truest sense, never really arrives. It only changes shape. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the last remnants of Dutch's dream ride into a life that is quieter, poorer, and somehow more frightening. In the months after the mountains, John, Abigail, and Jack become ghosts drifting through counties and territories. New names at every town. New stories for every suspicious sheriff or curious innkeeper. One week they are the Marstons, humble farmhands from Kansas. The next, the McBrides, passing through on their way to a dying uncle who does not exist. John takes whatever work civilization will give an able body and a forgettable face: ranch hand, fence builder, field laborer, hauling coal, breaking horses in the early light, always paid in cash, always underpaid, always ready to leave it all behind before dawn. For Abigail, this is a story of constant packing and unpacking, of sewing up torn shirts and trying to teach Jack his letters in borrowed rooms that never feel safe. For Jack, it is a childhood of half-heard arguments and half-remembered towns, where the only constant is the man who smells of tobacco and gun oil and tries, with painful awkwardness, to read him stories at night. John wants to be a father. His past only knows how to be an outlaw. Sleep offers no escape. When John closes his eyes, the snow returns. Arthur coughing in the mud. Hosea's lifeless body on the Saint Denis steps. Lenny falling through the dark. Dutch walking away into the mist, the living embodiment of betrayal and belief entwined. Some nights John wakes with his hand already reaching for a gun that is not there, heart pounding, breath ragged, Abigail watching from the doorway, knowing better than to ask which ghost visited this time. He fears one thing more than the nightmares: that Jack will grow up hearing the wrong version of the story. Out in saloons and rail depots, the Van der Linde gang is already turning into legend. Drunk cowhands brag about a train robbed single-handed by Dutch and his two sons. Travelers whisper about a camp that gave to the poor and bled the rich. A band of idealistic outlaws who fought civilization itself. Then someone points to a fading wanted poster, John's younger face half scarred and half smirking, and the room goes quiet. Rumor turns massacre into adventure, murder into myth, and betrayal into a cautionary tale. The gang becomes a warning and a fantasy at the same time. But behind those myths, men with ledgers and badges are listening carefully. In government offices far from the dust and the cattle, names are underlined, reports are filed, and one conclusion keeps appearing. One man walked away from Dutch's world and lived. John Marston. Last loyal son, last loose thread. Somewhere, agents begin to pull that thread, patiently preparing to drag him back into the light he has been running from since the very beginning. Beecher's hope begins as little more than a name on a deed and a scar on the horizon. A patch of scrubland, a leaning house, fences collapsing in on themselves. From its humble beginnings, the ranch is a story of desperation and defiance. A financial gamble that doubles as a quiet declaration. The outlaw trail ends here. John buys it with money that does not quite feel clean and a resolve that does not quite feel steady. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in that dying light he reaches for something he has never really had. Permanence. No more camps to burn, no more wagons to pack in the night. Just a fixed point on the map, a place his son can point to and say, in the truest sense, that it is home. He throws himself into the work with the same intensity he once brought to robberies and rescues. Now the jobs are smaller, quieter, but no less dangerous to his pride. Mending fences instead of breaking banks, breaking horses instead of Pinkerton lines. Learning the rhythm of seasons, not heists. Watching the sky for storms instead of pauses. His hands, once trained for the quick draw, learn the slow patience of hammering posts, hauling hay, and nursing sick cattle through long, cold nights. Every chore becomes an argument with his past. Each fence post driven straight is a rejection of his father's staggering failures, of the drunk in the wheelchair who died in a bar fight over a prostitute. Every honest dollar earned at the stockyard is a step away from the orphanage that branded him unwanted, away from the bullet that carved a permanent reminder into his face. He is trying to build a world where his son never has to learn that lesson in blood. Abigail sees the effort, but she also sees the cracks. Their life at Beecher's Hope is more stable. Yet tension lingers in the corners of the house the way smoke once lingered over campfires. She has heard promises before, from Dutch, from John, from men who believed freedom meant running until civilization gave up. Can this man, who once vanished before Blackwater and left her alone with a gang and a child, really stay put this time? Jack feels the change most of all, and understands it least. Here, his father reads to him instead of riding off for weeks. Here, the gunshots are distant, echoing from hunting trips rather than ambushes. Yet the unspoken history hangs over dinner tables and barn doors. Why does his father flinch at certain names? Why does Abigail go quiet when the past drifts too close? For Jack, Beecher's Hope is both sanctuary and mystery. For a moment, it almost works. The ranch becomes the living embodiment of John's fragile dream. A family, a roof that does not move, a future measured in harvests instead of bounties. He comes as close as an outlaw can to outrunning his own legend. But there is a flaw in the dream he cannot mend with wire and nails. To disappear, a man must be forgotten, and John Marston has never been forgotten. In government ledgers and agent reports, his address is written clearly, Beecher's Hope. Home and hunting ground. The past is not searching for him. It already knows exactly where he sleeps. Beecher's Hope might be a ranch on paper, but in the eyes of the new century it is something else entirely. A fixed coordinate in a world that wants everything pinned down, cataloged, and controlled. The world was changing, and the federal government intends to make sure men like John Marston either change with it or vanish beneath it. Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham arrive as the living embodiment of that new power. They are not sheriffs chasing cattle rustlers, nor bounty hunters working for a quick dollar. They are agents of a young bureau, backed by Washington, railroads, and telegraph wires, representing a civilization that files reports instead of legends. From their perspective, the story of the Van der Linde gang is not a tragedy. It is unfinished business. From the very beginning, John has been more than a name in those reports. He has been a guidebook. As Dutch's former golden boy, he rode with Bill Williamson into border towns, watched Javier Escuela vanish into the heat and dust of Mexico, and learned Dutch's habits from campfire talks and desperate flights. He knows the mountain passes Bill prefers when he is scared, the kind of cause Javier clings to when he needs to feel idealistic, the sermons Dutch repeats when he is trying to turn fear into philosophy. To the government, this is not romance, it is intelligence. Ross and Fordham understand that catching ghosts requires a man who once lived among them. They comb through ledgers, Pinkerton notes, and prison records until one name keeps circling back to the same conclusion. John Marston is the key. He knows the hideouts, the old contacts, the secret routes through canyons and across borders. More importantly, he knows the weaknesses that never made it into any file. But knowledge alone is not what makes John valuable. Vulnerability does. He is no longer a drifting outlaw with nothing to lose. He has a wife who once shared the gang's bedrolls and a son who plays in open fields instead of sleeping under wagons. He has a visible ranch, a mortgage, neighbors who can point to his front door. His past is written in his scars, his criminal record is written in ink. Ross does not have to threaten prison in the abstract. He can threaten the very land John is trying to fence. So the agents shape their coercion as a kind of poisoned mercy. Help the government, they say, and earn a clean slate. Hunt the men who made him, and maybe, in the truest sense, he can finally be free of them. It is a story of redemption weaponized, Dutch's old language of freedom and family twisted into a contract with the state. John hears echoes of campfire speeches and Ross's promises and feels the betrayal before the ink is dry. When he boards that train at the start of Red Dead Redemption, he is not a willing hero stepping into adventure. He is a cornered man stepping into a cage with the door left temptingly open. The old ways were dying, the new order demands a sacrifice, and somewhere out there, Bill, Javier, and Dutch are waiting. The question is not whether John can find them. The question is what will be left of him when he does. For John Marston, the government's hit list is not a roster of targets. It is a mirror. Each name the Bureau hands him is a piece of himself he thought he had buried, dragged back into the light and given a price. Bill Williamson comes first, and that is no accident. Bill is the living embodiment of John's violent, impulsive youth, the part of him that once believed fear was the purest form of respect. From its humble beginnings in those early camps, Bill had watched John swagger through gunfights, watched Dutch praise the boy's nerve, watched a scarred teenager learn that a quick temper and a quicker draw could make a cruel world step aside. Chasing Bill to Fort Mercer, John is not just hunting a brutal drunk hiding behind walls and men. He is staring down the memory of the hot-headed enforcer who rode into towns looking for an excuse to pull the trigger. The irony is almost cruel. The man who used to storm forts for Dutch now stands outside a fort as the government's battering ram, demanding surrender in the name of civilization. The world was changing, but the echoes are the same. Every time Bill spits John's name with that mix of hatred and hurt, it drags him back to campfires where they passed bottles, laughed at bad jokes, and pretended their philosophy was anything more than armed robbery with speeches. If Bill is the rage of John's past, Javier Escuela is its romance. In the truest sense, Javier represents the outlaw dream they once shared, two young men who believed they were freedom fighters on horseback, not just thieves running from consequence. Javier sang songs in Spanish by the fire, told stories of revolution and honor, and John listened, half believing they were part of something noble. When John tracks Javier through Mexico, that dream is stripped down to what it always was: survival. No grand speeches, no camp theatrics, just two aging gunmen hiding behind new flags and old excuses. Each time Javier calls him brother, it lands heavier than any bullet, because it carries every ride they ever took in defense of Dutch's fragile myth. Then there's Dutch. The final pursuit is not a bounty hunt. It is a story of son versus father, disciple versus prophet, each armed with an intimate map of the other's strengths and weaknesses. From the very beginning, Dutch had taken that orphanage runaway and turned him into a weapon, teaching him to read, to shoot, to hate the bars of the cage called society. Now the state points that same weapon back at its maker. Every step after Dutch forces John through a graveyard of memories. Hosea's quiet lessons, Arthur's rough brotherhood, Abigail's tired eyes when he came back from another job, drenched in someone else's blood. Around Dutch, those memories are sharper, because Dutch was there for all of them. And beneath it all lies the boy with the scar, the child shot in the face during a robbery, sent to an orphanage, passed between institutions and alleys until Dutch and Hosea found a lost soul and called him family. That boy was a victim of crime. Now he is crime's instrument, wearing a federal badge he never asked for, ordered to erase the only family he ever knew. Is that justice? Or just a new flavor of betrayal dressed up as law? Each time John raises his gun at Bill, at Javier, at Dutch, he is not just ending a chapter of the gang's history. He is amputating a part of himself. The old ways were dying, but the cost is written in the faces he aims at, in the campfire jokes that echo behind every shot. And somewhere beyond Dutch's final stand, the Bureau is already considering the last name on its secret list. John Marston's name sits alone on that secret list, and the trail of bodies finally leads him to the man who started it all. Dutch van der Linde, mentor, tormentor, and the living embodiment of a dream that has rotted from the inside. This is not a reunion. It is a reckoning that has been marching toward this cliff from the very beginning. When John finds Dutch in the mountains in 1911, the change is unmistakable. The old outlaw philosopher is older, more tired, his swagger eaten away by years of running from a world that no longer has room for him. The world was changing, and Dutch knows it, even as he pretends otherwise. He talks about government conspiracies, about natives being crushed under civilization, about men like them being pushed to the margins. To Dutch, they are all just victims of progress, cornered animals lashing out. Yet even in defeat, his philosophy clings to him. He frames every atrocity as resistance, every massacre as a necessary stand against betrayal and control. The gang's story, in his mouth, is still a story of freedom stolen by cowards in suits. John listens, but the words no longer land. He has seen too many dead innocents, too many broken families, to believe this is rebellion in the truest sense. It sounds less like a cause, and more like an old man begging history to remember him as something other than a criminal. Dutch's final choice comes not with a gunshot, but with a step. Cornered on the cliff edge, with John and Edgar Ross closing in, Dutch looks at the man he raised and sees the last mirror of his own failure. He refuses the indignity of chains, of being paraded as a trophy for the very system he spent his life cursing. So he takes control of the one thing left to him. He falls. One last act of defiance, one last illusion of freedom, turning his own death into a statement rather than a sentence. For John, there is no triumph in that fall, no catharsis, no sense that justice has finally been done. Only a hollow inevitability, as if this ending was written the day Dutch chose to live outside the law forever and convinced lost soul after lost soul to follow. Dutch's body hits the rocks below, but what really dies on that cliff is John's last belief that violence can ever be righteous, that a gun can ever truly serve a higher cause. All that remains is duty. Not to Dutch's broken philosophy, not to the gang's faded dreams, but to Abigail and Jack. John returns to Beecher's Hope with the weary relief of a man who believes the nightmare is finally over. The list is finished. The debt is paid. The government has its victory. Yet as he rides past the fences he built and the home he is still learning to inhabit, the next betrayal is already taking shape in Ross's office, proving that the old ways were dying, but the new order is no kinder. The debt is paid. The list is finished. And then the government sends an army to his front gate. Ross does not ride out alone to Beecher's Hope with a handshake and a signature. He arrives with soldiers, lawmen, and rifles, the living embodiment of a state that no longer bothers to pretend. They spread across John's land, take positions in the hills and behind the fences he hammered into the ground, and box him in under the pretense of tying up loose ends. This is not justice. It is a clean erasure. The moment John sees the dust on the horizon, the story of his so-called freedom ends and a story of betrayal begins. He understands what this means almost instantly. The house he built with Abigail, the fields he plowed, the quiet mornings with Jack reading on the porch, these were never a pardon. They were a holding pattern. The world was changing, and men like John were never meant to walk into that new world alive. Inside the barn, with bullets already chewing through the wood, John makes the last real decision of his life. He shoves Abigail and Jack toward the back doors, orders them onto the horses, and sends them riding for a future he will never see. There is no speech about destiny, no grand philosophy, only a father who finally understands what loyalty costs. He knows he will not survive. He steps out anyway. For John, that walk into the sunlight is an echo from the very beginning. As a boy, he stood in front of guns with no real choice at all, shot in the face during a robbery, orphaned by a drunk father and a world that did not care. Dutch and Hosea once found that lost soul and turned him into an outlaw, teaching him to run, to fight, to disappear when the odds were bad. Now, under Ross's command, the odds are worse than they have ever been. Yet John does the one thing Dutch never taught. He stays. He chooses to stand and protect instead of run and survive. What follows is not a duel, not a romantic last ride, but a firing squad masquerading as progress. The state asserts its dominance in the truest sense, not by bringing down a gang in the middle of a heist, but by gunning down the last of the Vanderlinde legacy on his own land, in front of his own barn. The old ways were dying, and the new civilization makes its point with a volley of lead. When Jack rides back and finds his father's body, the myth of redemption dies with him. The boy inherits more than a ranch. He inherits a history of violence, of government betrayal, of dreams that came from its humble beginnings in an idealistic philosophy and ended in a bloodstain in the dust. What else can a child raised on that memory become? The answer to that question will decide whether John's death closes the book or merely turns the page. John's story, in the truest sense, is written on his face. That scar is more than a memorable design choice. It is a timeline. A mark carved into a terrified child during a robbery, carried by a celebrated outlaw at the height of Dutch's dreams, and finally worn by a tired husband trying to shield his family from the very world that created it. From the very beginning, that wound says what the frontier keeps proving. Civilization and savagery are never far apart. A 10-year-old boy is shot in the face and dumped in the dirt, not by some legendary gunslinger, but by petty thieves chasing easy money. Institutions take him in, then cast him out. An orphanage that cannot keep him. A state that will not protect him. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family promised and family denied. So when Dutch and Hosea find him at 12 or 13, a half-starved lost soul trying to rob them and getting caught in the act, it feels almost merciful. Dutch offers philosophy where the orphanage offered rules. Hosea offers survival where the state offered paperwork. John learns that the gang is family, that the gang means freedom, that the gang stands against a rigged civilization. It sounds idealistic. It sounds righteous. It sounds true to a boy who has only known cages. But the scar outlives the speeches. As the years pass, John discovers that any system built by men can turn its sons into tools. Dutch's campfire sermons about liberty become justifications for ever bloodier robberies. The government's language of order and progress becomes a mask for extortion, blackmail, and quiet murder. John is used by the gang as its golden gun hand, then discarded when he questions Dutch. Later, he is used by the Bureau as a hunting dog, then slaughtered when his usefulness ends. Gang or government, freedom or civilization, the pattern is the same. Dutch's experiment was supposed to break that pattern. He wanted to prove that he could take broken children like Arthur and John and make them the living embodiment of his creed. Instead, his ego curdles into paranoia. His sons become enforcers, then liabilities, then targets standing between him and his own legend. What does it mean when the man who promised to save lost boys ends up aiming a gun at them? John's attempt at redemption cannot erase the bodies behind him. It does not make him a classic hero, and it never quite lets him sink into pure villainy. He becomes something more human and more tragic, a man who finally understands the harm he has done, yet can only pay for it with one life, at one ranch, on one autumn afternoon. And the scar does not die with him. It passes, invisibly, to Jack. The son of a man who tried, too late, to break the cycle, now stands at a crossroads, repeat the gunman's path, or walk away from the myth entirely. Which choice he makes will decide whether John Marston's story ends in the dust or echoes into a new generation. John Marston's life, taken as a whole, is a story of one long, desperate attempt to outrun a scar that began long before Beecher's hope. From its humble beginnings in a half-remembered childhood to that final stand against the firing line, every phase of his past casts a shadow across Red Dead Redemption's present. The very beginning is brutal and small, A drunk father in a wagon accident, a mother gone too early, a boy shot in the face during a robbery and shipped off to an orphanage that could barely keep him inside its walls. Those early escapes explain the man on the train in RDR1 who hates institutions, who distrusts government orders, who drags his feet every time civilization tells him what he has to do. He has been caged before. He remembers. Dutch's rescue, finding a half-starved teenager stealing on the street, is not just charity. It is recruitment. Dutch and Hosea turn a lost soul into a prodigy, teaching him to read, to ride, to shoot, to believe that crime can be a philosophy. Those golden boy years explain why John moves through RDR1 with such lethal grace, why he can clear Fort Mercer or charge into Escalera with the calm of a veteran. He has done versions of these jobs since he was 13. But that same period also explains his bitterness. Dutch does not simply save him, Dutch owns him. The gang becomes his family in the truest sense, but it is a family where love is always tangled with debt. When John hesitates in RDR1, when he mocks Dutch's speeches while still sounding strangely protective, it is the voice of a son who has seen the best and worst of his father's dreams and delusions. His disappearance before Blackwater, the quiet collapse of loyalty, and the gang's eventual ruin give context to every argument in RDR1. John knows exactly how far Dutch will go, because he already watched the ideals rot from the inside. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch chose delusion over adaptation. John's reluctance to hunt him is not weakness, it is mourning. Then comes Beecher's hope. The ranch is not a random setting, it is the living embodiment of everything John never had. A stable home, legal work, a chance for Jack to grow up with books instead of guns. His fierce protectiveness in RDR1, the way he snaps when Jack is threatened, the way he pushes the boy towards stories rather than shootouts, flows directly from that broken childhood and those bloody years under Dutch. Of course, many details between these milestones live between the lines. Rockstar's fragmented storytelling almost invites reconstruction. Offhand comments about orphanages, throwaway lines about early robberies, Dutch's shifting tone when he talks about John, all of it encourages careful players to assemble a hidden prequel running beneath both games. Where the record falls silent, this reconstruction has followed the grain of history and theme, not wild invention. If John was a teenage enforcer, if he rode on early raids against men who later become RDR1 targets, those choices are grounded in what the games imply about his reputation and the government's leverage. Seen this way, Red Dead Redemption is not just the end of an outlaw. It is the final chapter of a life already written in orphanage ledgers, campfire speeches, and abandoned hideouts. Every mission, every strained conversation with Dutch or Abigail becomes an echo of those missing years, and the next steps in this saga will only deepen that resonance. Seen this way, the Van der Linde saga becomes a story of memory and omission, of what is shown and what is left in shadow. The missions are one thing. The silences between them are another. Those silences are where John Marston truly lives. Revisited with this reconstructed past in mind, Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2 change shape. A throwaway line about an orphanage becomes a scar reopening. A half-joking remark about Dutch raising him becomes a courtroom testimony no one asked to hear. Each small exchange with Abigail, each stiff conversation with Jack, carries the weight of the boy shot in the face, the teenager turned into an outlaw prodigy, the man discarded when civilization no longer needed his kind. From its humble beginnings in that orphanage ledger to the final stand at Beecher's Hope, John's life becomes the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy collapsing in on itself. Freedom promised, dependence delivered. Family offered, control enforced. In the truest sense, the ranch is not a happy ending. It is a last, desperate experiment to prove that all the blood, all the betrayals, meant something. Does it succeed, or only underline the tragedy of believing that redemption can be bargained for with one last good deed? Yet John's missing years are only one fracture in this larger world of ghosts. The gaps around Abigail hint at another untold chronicle, a woman surviving campfire jokes and backhanded respect, raising a child in the shadow of men who claim to fight for freedom while chaining her to their delusions. Javier's revolutionary past in Mexico suggests an earlier, more idealistic crusade, where the rhetoric of justice first met the reality of power. Bill's military trauma whispers through every flinch, every overreaction, The old ways were dying long before Dutch ever spoke of progress. None of this excuses what John does. The robberies, the killings, the years of absence from his own son do not vanish under the weight of a sad childhood. Understanding the very beginning of his story does not acquit him. It indicts the entire system that took a wounded child and taught him that a gun and a gang were the only answers. When he steps out of that barn door at Beecher's Hope, it is not as a pure hero or a simple victim. It is as a man who finally refuses to run from the consequences that have been chasing him since that first bullet tore his face apart. So, which moments speak the loudest? The way John hesitates before Dutch's corpse on the cliff? The quiet, awkward conversations with Jack about reading and adventure? The bitter, almost embarrassed memories he shares with Bonnie, as if testing whether another life was ever truly possible? Every player carries a different shard of this shattered story. Which lines, which glances, feel most haunted by years never shown on screen? And which other lost soul in this saga deserves a full reconstruction of their own history? Because in the end, three images define John Marston's place in this dying frontier. A boy in the dirt with a bullet in his face, abandoned by civilization. A man on a train, being delivered back into the hands of the government he once defied. A father in a barn door, framed by rifle barrels and broken promises. Three versions of the same scarred survivor, carrying the same wound through a world that was changing too fast to ever make room for men like him. That is where his story began. That is where it ends. And for anyone willing to look again, that is where it will keep on living,